The tournament was never about glory. It was a crucible, and only a few will emerge unbroken. In this thrilling final part of Champions, secrets are unearthed, loyalties are tested, and the champions must face the deadliest challenge of all, the truth. Welcome back to Grimoire Audiobooks, where fanfiction comes alive. Today, we bring you part 3 of Champions by Thor's Shadow, the final stretch in this darker, deeper Triwizard Tournament that has reshaped how we see our favorite magical world. Disclaimer: this audiobook is a fan-made adaptation of the story Champions by Thor's Shadow, based on Harry Potter characters and settings by J.K. Rowling. It's shared purely for entertainment and to honor the creative spirit of fan works. In this powerful conclusion, nothing is as it seems. Shadows of the past rise, champions make impossible choices, and by the end, the meaning of victory itself will be redefined. If you've journeyed with us this far, thank you. If you're new here, strap in. You're about to hear a finale that refuses to play by the old rules. Don't forget to subscribe, like, or join the Wizard Army to support more immersive audiobooks like this one. Let's finish Champions by Thor's Shadow. Chapter 41. Family. Contrary to expectations, the day of the third task dawned cold, dull, and dreary. Harry and Fleur ignored it as they trudged into the great hall, both feeling that the weather reflected their mood almost perfectly. As prepared as they were for the task, they still wanted nothing to do with it, even Fleur, who had entered by choice, Maxime's manipulations notwithstanding. But alas, they had to participate. The first annoyance of the day arrived partway through breakfast in the form of the Daily Prophet. Skeeter had been quiet of late, seeming to have been supplanted by writers who were actually competent rather than mere muckrakers, which Harry figured was Sebastian's doing, but now she was back, and in fine form. His mood darkened ominously as he read the article. Tournament finale tonight. Will Potter cheat again? By Rita Skeeter. The world-famous Triwizard Tournament, being held at Hogwarts Castle, will conclude tonight with the final task of the competition. But as the big finish approaches, one cannot help but wonder, will the legitimate Hogwarts champion even have a chance? Cheating has run rampant, and an honorable young man like Cedric Diggory would clearly never stoop to that level, which creates an extremely uneven playing field. While recent events have diverted our attention, we must not forget that the fix has been in right from the start, beginning with the illegal entry of Harry Potter. Our one-time hero, seeking attention due to his fading fame, forced his way into the tournament, and he certainly succeeded in making more headlines as a result. It makes one wonder what else the child has done, and the lengths he might go to in order to win this most prestigious of contests. Even the mysterious events of the now infamous second task are suspect. Nobody saw what went on in the lake, so how do we know what really happened? His unfortunate wife is, as Avila, rather beautiful. What young boy would not want her? We also saw his questionable performance in the first task. He may have succeeded, but his methods went against the very spirit of the competition. If world-famous seeker Victor Crumb did not fly, then was it really acceptable for Harry Potter to do so? Or perhaps he thought he could show Crumb up by cheating the task with his broom. And what will his appearance at the third task portend? Given how lethal previous competitions have been, one can only hope that Potter is not as bloody-minded as his recent actions have made him appear. Could one or more of our brave competitors come to harm at Potter's hand as he tries to steal the show? Only time will tell. This reporter will be solidly rooting for Cedric Diggory, the legitimate Hogwarts champion. He, at least, can be counted on to compete fairly and to produce a respectable win for Hogwarts. Unless Potter cheats again, of course. Harry stared at the article in a curious mixture of anger and astonishment. Her implications regarding the second task were particularly vile, not to mention absolutely ridiculous, and that she practically accused him of wanting to hurt his fellow competitors. He didn't even have the words to express his feelings on that. But did she really think she was going to get away with this? Anyone with a brain had realized by now that Harry Potter was no longer the defenseless orphan with nobody to protect him. He had protectors now, and they were likely to go after her with both barrels, as the Muggles said. And Fleur clearly agreed. Papa will ave seen this, she growled, obviously on the same wavelength as he was. She can say goodbye to her career. She forgot that people are looking after you now. I don't understand how she's been getting away with it in the first place, frowned Hermione from across the table. There should be laws against this sort of thing. There are, Neville put in, but you have to press charges to make anything happen, and you know how biased our government is. Of course, if Dumbledore actually did his job, it would never have happened anyway, grumbled Harry. He could easily have neutered Skeeter. He just doesn't care about his students. Only said they do his bidding, agreed Fleur. Hermione nodded thoughtfully, but elected not to pursue it further. She was learning to cut her losses when something was pointless. Papa will deal with, mon amour, repeated Fleur. That will do, career in. She has made a living from ensuring that she cannot be blamed for lies, and she has overstepped air. Badly. Harry nodded his agreement, but his attention was already wandering. He was too busy noticing that there had been no comment from the Slytherins. It seemed that they were much less interested in bothering him without Snape and Malfoy there to egg them on. It was a pleasant surprise, really. Looking back, things had been much less tense in the castle since Snape's departure, and even more so since Malfoy's. To Harry, it was just another indication that Dumbledore was an abject failure as a headmaster. Had he reined them in from the get-go, the school would have been a much more pleasant place. And had he reined them in from the get-go, Draco Malfoy might not be serving 10 years in Azkaban prison for attempted murder. The more he thought about it, the more he laid the blame for the more obvious of their society's ills right at Dumbledore's feet. He had even taught Voldemort, for Merlin's sake. His attitude had not done anyone any favors. Harry could not wait to haul him up on charges and get him out of his positions of power. As the breakfast hour wound down, Professor McGonagall informed the champions that their families were congregating to spend the day with them. And for the first time in his life, Harry Potter was actually happy about such an arrangement. He had never had family to care about him before. The surprise was clear on his face, however, when he entered the room, with Fleur his attention centered on where he had spotted the Delacours standing with Sirius only to be blindsided by a stifling hug from someone he didn't expect. He knew who it was without even thinking about it, but could not for the life him imagine why Molly Weasley would even be in the room. Where he'd been merely unsettled by her overbearing hugs before, now it was deeply uncomfortable, especially given the incident with the howler before the wedding. He allowed it out of shock for only the briefest of moments, but then came back to his senses and pushed her away. From the corner of his eye he could see his wife's narrowed gaze. She was not happy with the intrusion. "Mrs. Weasley?" he asked, a little more faintly than he would have liked. "What are you doing here?" The woman herself looked startled that he'd pushed away from her. Harry also noted that Bill was present, standing behind her with his hands in his pockets and a deep frown on his face, looking very uncomfortable with being there at all. The whole situation was rather confusing. "We're here to support you, of course, Harry dear," she replied. "You need your family, so of course dash." "But you are not family, Madam Weasley," interrupted a frowning Fleur. "That would be my mamman and papa, and his own godfather." Harry struggled to keep his thoughts off his face. He had never truly considered how the Weasleys behaved before, but he suddenly saw with crystal clarity how they had tried to usurp the title of family upon meeting him. He doubted it was in any way malicious on their part. They weren't that kind of people near, as he could tell, but it was still fairly offensive. He only hadn't noticed before because he hadn't any living family for them to usurp the title from, but however well-intentioned, it was truly disrespectful, not least to his late parents. Fleur's family, at least, had earned the title properly through his marriage to their daughter. And suddenly he found himself having to think quickly before the situation devolved into something ugly. He had no doubt that Fleur was thinking similar thoughts, and so likely were the Delacours and Sirius. But as wary as he was of Molly Weasley, he truly didn't think her actions malicious. Naive and unintentionally offensive, perhaps, but not malicious. Nevertheless, he had to set the record straight. There was simply no other option here. And also, Dumbledore invited you, didn't he? He finally sighed, drawing everyone's attention once more. Of course, she frowned. He said you didn't have any family to support you, and that you thought of us as family. And now, EETES clear, grumbled Fleur. Easy love, he told her in nearly fluent French, hoping that the Weasleys didn't speak it. This is the headmaster playing his games again, and they're as much victims of that as we are. Fleur tilted her head slightly, and he met her gaze, impressing upon her that he truly believed that. He could see it when she accepted the truth of it only an instant later, and deflated back to a more relaxed stance even as she nodded at him. Turning back to Molly, he switched back to English. The headmaster likes to stick his nose in where it doesn't belong, Mrs. Weasley, he told her bluntly. While he might want you to believe that I saw you that way. And, I mean no offense when I say this, but it just isn't the case. Fleur's family is my family now, and my godfather is my family. Those are the only family I've ever recognized beyond my late parents. I appreciate your care over the years, but you're my good friends, not my family. The conversation had, of course, drawn the Delacours and Sirius over to them. In the background, he could see the Diggory family and the Crumbs trying to look like they weren't listening in. Harry didn't care about the latter two. It wasn't his reputation that would suffer. Albus, as a truly unhealthy and highly inappropriate interest in my son-in-law Molly, noted Sebastian finally joining in the conversation. I do not know what his purpose was with this, but mark my words, he had one. And it was certainly not for Harry's benefit, nor for yours. It was clear that Molly Weasley didn't know what to say, and was far too shocked to even bother being offended. Her mouth was opening and closing without any sound coming out, and she was staring, almost horrified, at Sebastian as she processed the implications of what he was saying. Only Harry and his family knew the probable reason for Dumbledore's interest. The rest were clueless of the existence of the prophecy, and that made it look that much worse from an outside perspective. On behalf of House Weasley, Bill suddenly intoned, you have our sincere apologies for any offense we may have caused. It was not intentional, and as heir of the house, I will inform our head of house and ensure that it does not happen again. Molly paled at this declaration. Harry had barely scratched the surface of true wizarding culture, but he recognized that this was serious. As head of House Potter, your apology is accepted, he replied as formally as he could. He didn't know the proper forms yet, but would do his best. But really, it's unnecessary, Bill. This is Dumbledore's doing, not your family's. Thanks, Harry, but they should have known better anyway. He smiled. I'll take care of it and make sure it doesn't happen again. Let me get Mum back home. But I'd like to speak with you on an unrelated matter if you have a few minutes before the task tonight. Of course, nodded Harry. They all watched as Bill herded a lost and confused Molly Weasley out of the room. Harry felt a pang of sadness at that she truly had meant well, he thought, but he also agreed with Bill that she should have known better. It was one thing before he was married, but now she should have been far more suspicious of Dumbledore. Remind me to bring you up to speed on the proper forms for things like that. Harry, Sirius finally said, but that was very well handled, especially given that Dumbledore didn't see to your training as heir or head of house like he should have. Harry saw this statement as the theater that it was Amos Diggory would likely have it all over the ministry by tomorrow that Dumbledore had failed the heir of the Potter family. Frankly, however, he had other concerns, like the fact that his godfather was here in person and in public without Dementors swarming around. He couldn't help the grin that came over him. "Sirius," he burst, grabbing his godfather in an uncharacteristic hug. "I'm so glad you're free." Sirius chuckled. "So am I," he grinned. "And that's all thanks to you, Harry. So thank you." The rest of the afternoon proceeded splendidly. There was no real need to show the Delacours or Sirius around the campus, so they simply found a convenient location where they could enjoy the beauty of the day. It was an almost surreal experience for Harry. He had never simply spent time with his family before. That simple first was one he would truly never forget. They were all spread out on a blanket at the edge of the Black Lake, and Harry was leaning back into Fleur's warm embrace. He still couldn't believe that he was married to her, but he wouldn't trade it for anything. Her mere presence made everything seem lighter and happier, and it wasn't her allure of that he was certain. The conversation meandered aimlessly over the course of the afternoon. Little of real substance was discussed by some strange, unspoken agreement. The closest it got was a question from Sirius about what Fleur would be doing with herself after graduation. Since Harry and Fleur had discussed that, it was easy enough to answer. Both of them categorically refused, however, to share their strategy for the task or even that it was a shared one in the first place. They were looking forward to seeing their family's reaction to what they saw as a major prank on the tournament and its organizers. In their mind, it was definitely going to be one for the record books. Finally, though, they were brought back down to earth by the return of Bill Weasley. They hadn't discussed that situation at all either, but really, what was there to discuss? Dumbledore's motives were generally unclear even when he was being transparent about things. In this case, they would probably never know why he had bothered with such a scheme. "Sorry to bother you," said Bill when he finally found them. "But do you have a minute, Harry?" Harry looked up at him and smiled. "Have a seat, Bill," he offered. "If it's about what I think it is, then everyone here is in the know." Bill nodded and joined them on the blanket. The elder Delacours had left Gabrielle at home with Caterine. They weren't letting her anywhere near Hogwarts after she was literally kidnapped for use in the second task. That meant that only Sebastian was unknown to Bill, and it was relatively obvious that he was trusted. "I just wanted to give you a quick update," he offered. "The goblins hate these things, and they've been tracking them down as their highest priority. They actually found one in the bank, if you can believe that." "Someone was foolish enough to place a Horcrux within Gringotts," gasped Sebastian. "That is a death sentence for that person, wizard or not. It is in the treaties." Bill smirked. "Unfortunately for us, the vault belonged to Bellatrix Lestrange," he informed them, "so she probably won't die by goblin steel, since she's in Azkaban. Her vault is another story, though. They confiscated it, and Harry and Fleur will get a significant chunk since they reported it to Gringotts through me." Harry figured that the satisfaction that shone in Bill's expression was probably mirrored in his own. He couldn't care less about the money, but anything bad that befell a Death Eater was music to his ears. "This is excellent news," noted Fleur. "But what of the others? You said there were 5 or 6, and at least half of them have been collected and destroyed. There was a locket in the Black home in London," he continued. Clearly, Sirius knew of this, as he wasn't surprised in the slightest. "Then there was the one at Gringotts, and an object they found here at Hogwarts. How they found it and got it out, I don't know, but it was also destroyed." Harry nodded in satisfaction. To see so much progress made in such a short time was a revelation. Why hadn't Dumbledore done this a decade ago. Surely Voldemort would be naught but a memory had he done so. It was disturbing, really. What was Dumbledore playing at? And Z Ozzers, asked Darien. Those will be more difficult. Sighed Bill. We know they're at or near the ancestral Riddle estate, but we're going to have to be careful. We're fairly certain that's where Voldemort himself is right now. Everyone present groaned in annoyance. It was one thing to dig something up that wasn't being watched, but quite another if the madman himself was sitting right on top of it. Say what you would about Voldemort, he was known to be exceptionally dangerous. It was easy to understand the goblin's caution. Is there anything we can do to help? Asked Harry after a moment. Not that I know of, Bill denied. Just get through the tournament, and we'll worry about it this summer. Worst case, we can lure him out and see about it then. 2 or 3 more, sighed Fleur, giving him a squeeze, and then it will be over for good. Harry couldn't wait. Bill excused himself shortly after bringing them up to speed and after delivering another heartfelt apology for what Molly had tried to do. Her actions had been highly offensive by wizarding standards, and while Harry wasn't going to hold it against her due to her good intentions, the Weasley heir was another matter entirely. Bill said he expected that his father would be equally disturbed by it once he understood the magnitude of the transgression. As the afternoon gave way to evening, they all trooped back up to the castle for dinner. That was where Hermione finally rejoined their party. While she no more had exams than Harry did an advantage of having transferred to Bosbaton, she, unlike Molly Weasley, had recognized his need for time with his true family. Harry was deeply grateful to her for being such a good friend. As dinner started to wind down, she just couldn't keep it in any longer. Though, are you two ready for the task? She asked worriedly. Harry and Fleur chuckled at her, though. Relax, he told her calmly. This task will be easier than the first 2. We've both got it covered. Next to him, Fleur nodded her beautiful head. He is right, Hermione, she smiled. There is no need to worry. Well, I, for one, hope you win, grinned Sirius, to Harry's amusement. Imagine the look on their faces when a 4th-year student beats Hogwarts' supposed champion. It had to be said that Sirius was not impressed with Diggory, or rather, with Diggory's father. The man had, to Cedric's obvious embarrassment, made a nuisance of himself earlier, effectively trying to proclaim that his son was better than Harry Potter. It was a rather appalling display that was likely to have earned him a rollicking from his wife when he got home. Just be careful, said Sebastian, with not a trace of humor. I would rather you lose than win at cost of a permanent injury. True, that, agreed Sirius. Harry exchanged a smile with his wife. If only they knew. It'll be fine, he offered. Like I said, we've got it covered. Besides, he thought to himself, it's not like we don't already know that the consequences this tournament inflicts can be permanent. Chapter 42 Teamwork, excited chatter, filled the air all around them as the champions waited for the task to officially begin. The stands surrounding the Quidditch pitch were packed full of people, including many dignitaries. Fleur could spot the British, French, and Bulgarian ministers of magic right off, and there were many other notables besides. It looked like half or more of the British Wizengamot had also turned up to see the spectacle. She could only shake her head at the sheer insanity of it all. A tournament with only 4 contestants, all of whom were only just into adulthood or flat out underage in the case of her new husband, competing in an event that they as spectators would barely even be able to watch. That was what they were here for. To be fair, she doubted that most of them knew the latter fact, and indeed would be very disappointed by it, but the first 2 facts remained. Why children competing in deadly tasks was such a draw to them mystified her. If anything, it should have horrified them. But here they were, waiting to see a spectacle that they knew could rapidly turn deadly. It had already had life-changing consequences in her and Harry's case, and they were all too aware of that fact. It did not speak well of magical society. Did the Weasley twins come up with anything? Wondered Cedric from his position next to Harry. Not that we know of, Harry replied. They were looking into it, but they don't want to get caught interfering with an international event. Which was probably smart of them, nodded Fleur, especially given what we, Ave, planned. Crumb, on her side of the gaggle they formed, smirked. It will be amusing, he grinned. Fleur couldn't help but grin back. At least their fellow champions weren't sticks in the mud. The spectators were going to be disappointed to learn that they traveled all this way for a task that only took 2 minutes to complete. Still nothing to stop us, noted Harry, having finished examining the pitch. So we're clear to go with it. Cedric opened his mouth, again probably to ask if they were all still in, but Bagman arrived before he could say anything. The man made Fleur's skin crawl. He was a disgusting pig, in her view. And before he started announcing, he cast a charm that would allow the audience to hear everything that both he and the champions said. It was a 2-part charm that Fleur was only vaguely familiar with. Someone competent had clearly cast the complicated part earlier, and Bagman's spell merely activated it. Fleur rather thought it was likely going to backfire on him. In the stands behind the entrance to the maze, Sirius Black sat with the Delacour family and watched the champions while keeping a weather eye on everything else around him. He found it a novel experience being out in public like this. It had been far, far too long since he was able to live his life. No thanks to Dumbledore, but that was neither here nor there at the moment. Watching Harry with Fleur was a balm to his tortured soul. He had no idea if he would ever find love himself. He was damaged goods to be certain, but that his godson had managed it, no matter in what fashion, warmed his tarnished heart. Fleur and Harry, to his eyes, were simply meant to be. Remus would likely have been reminded of James and Lily, but not Sirius. Harry was a very different person from James Potter, and Fleur was nothing at all like Lily. On top of that, and as much as he hated to say it, their love was far deeper than he had ever observed between the late Elder Potters. Not that James and Lily weren't very much in love, they were, but Harry and Fleur took it to a whole new level. Those who had known Playboy Sirius Black in school would have been shocked to learn that he was a closet romantic and that he truly did know what love was. Then and now, he simply didn't think he would ever find the sort of love he craved for himself. He enjoyed very much seeing it in others, though, and Harry and Fleur were sterling examples in his book. He continued to watch as they stood and chatted with the other champions. Even the manner in which they stood spoke of their love for one another. It was subtle, but it was there. He had to admit that he was jealous, and not because she was Vila. They look so good together, he sighed to himself. Don't they? Asked Sebastian from his left. I never would Ave thought of this match for, but he really does complete, in a way I could never Ave predicted. And she him nodded serious. I don't know him as well as I'd like for obvious reasons, but I know he's not a very social sort. She seems totally immune to that, though. He's completely comfortable with her. You're not wrong, came Hermione Granger's voice from his other side. She had followed them out and joined them in the stands. I know him better than anyone, except maybe for Fleur now, of course. And I can tell you that the way he is with her is totally unlike the way he is with anyone else. Even you? Asked Ariane softly from Sebastian's other side. It was clear to Sirius that she was fishing to see if the magically forced marriage had disrupted something else, but Hermione rose to the occasion. Even me, she nodded decisively, with a wry smile lingering on her lips. Besides, I've always thought of him more like a brother. I don't know that I could ever give him the kind of comfort she does. And then the conversation was interrupted by Ludo Bagman announcing the start of the task. Sirius listened intently as the aging former Quidditch star explained how things were supposed to work, and then finally blew his whistle to send Harry and Cedric Diggory into the maze. Neither boy moved, and Sirius blinked. Something was up. And fortunately, the area around the champions had been charmed to project what was said to the audience, which meant that they were about to find out exactly what that was. "Well, go on," Bagman urged, his voice echoing around the arena due to the charm's work on the platform. "The clock is ticking." To Sirius' increasing amusement, Harry looked at the man like he was crazy. "But that wouldn't be sporting, Mr. Bagman," he said, his voice projected into the stands with perfect clarity. "We want to be fair about this, right?" "I agree with Harry," added Diggory. "It wouldn't be sporting to go ahead of the others." Sirius grinned and glanced over at Diggory the Elder Arse, but the man was just sitting there staring. He looked quite shocked by his son's behavior. Poor Cedric. He was likely to get a talking to when he got home. In the meantime, he couldn't help but giggle aloud this time. He hadn't had this much fun since before Azkaban. It was quite clear to Harry that Bagman had no idea what to make of his and Cedric's behavior or what to do about it. That made him want to laugh, but he somehow managed to keep a straight face. Luckily for Bagman, though, Professor Moody soon made an appearance. "Problem, Ludo?" he asked curiously. Bagman just sputtered. "They're apparently going to wait and go with the others," he admitted, clearly forgetting that everyone could hear him. "Don't know why they'd want to give up such a big advantage." Moody's eye spun for a moment before landing on Harry. "This true, Potter?" he asked. "Wouldn't be sporting otherwise," Harry shrugged. "Well, there you go," he said to Bagman. "Maybe you should just get on with it, Ludo." Bagman appeared reluctant, but he started. "Moody's right," interrupted Cedric. "Might as well get on with it. We're not changing our minds. Right, Harry?" "Right, Cedric." While there was a fair bit of laughter at the champion's antics and the flummoxed former Quidditch star, Sirius was finding it far too difficult to stay quiet. Next to him, Sebastian raised a curious eyebrow, clearly not understanding the reason for his mirth. Sirius chortled again before turning to speak to him, though he still kept one eye on the action or lack thereof. 10 galleons says they're going to prank the tournament. He grinned at the man. "No bet," smirked Sebastian. "My mother did not raise a fool." Sirius. When he turned to Hermione, she rolled her eyes. "Before this year, I might have actually taken you up on that," she admitted. "But now, no, thank you." Sirius grinned and refocused on his godson. "Fine," grumbled Bagman, to the audience's rising amusement. "Then next up, we have Victor Crumb of Durmstrang." And with that, he blew his whistle again only for Victor to continue standing there lazily. "Not you two, whine Bagman." Laughter rang out, far more prevalent than before. Sirius was grinning like a loon. Whoever had planned this prank had done a bang-up job. They were, at the very least, making Bagman look like the idiot he was. "Duh," retorted Victor. "AM sportsman. Must be sporting." Sirius was already suppressing more giggles when Victor's response came through, and Hermione's abrupt facepalm almost sent him into gales of laughter. It was only his need to hear whatever was next that kept him silent. Hermione, for her part, was clearly horrified. She had gone to the Yule Ball with Crumb, he recalled. "AM sportsman," she repeated faintly. "Like me caveman? I know for a fact that Victor's command of the English language is much better than that." Sirius kept silently giggling away. "Fine," groused Bagman uncharitably. "Fleur Delacour, Beau's batons, last place. Go." And the final whistle was blown. Predictably, Fleur simply stood there with the others. None of them made a move to enter the maze. "And now my daughter is involved," grinned Ariane. "Oh, this is so very amusing." "Definitely worth coming to watch," agreed Sebastian. Sirius could see Moody down on the platform, also looking truly amused. "Have fun with this," Ludo smirked the old orer, and then he wandered off. "Well, are you going in or not?" Bagman finally burst. utterly exasperated with them, causing the audience to roar with laughter. Mused Harry. Maybe we should get going. I mean, they did go to all the trouble of setting this up, and all. We, nodded Fleur. And Z, sooner this is over, Z better. Duh, agreed Victor. Definitely, nodded Cedric. Then all four of them moved into a line and raised their wands. Accio Broom. Their entire area of the stands burst into cheers as the champions' intentions became clear. Sirius had actually read the rules and knew beyond doubt that this was a perfectly legal move. The entire task was a joke, really, if you looked at all the various cheats that the rules failed to disallow. Sneaking a peek at Dumbledore almost made him lose his composure once and for all. The man looked like he needed medical attention for a common bowel condition. He clearly did not approve of the champion's antics. Magnifique, gushed Ariane. A perfect solution, grinned Sebastian. No real danger to the champions. And they reduced the entire task to little more than a broom race. Oh, I don't think it's a race, smirked Hermione. Oh, asked Sebastian. Hermione turned to Sirius with an evil grin. 10 galleons says they're going to tie it, she offered. Deliberately. There was a brief silence in their section of the stands before laughter suddenly erupted from almost everyone. Even Sirius had missed the obvious. She was right. He was chortling so much that he had to shake his head at her to decline her bet. Then they watched as the champions flew up over the hedges and out to the middle of the maze before losing altitude and disappearing from view. It would probably be only moments before the task was over. The laughter coming from the stands at their antics was long and loud, much to the champions' pleasure. Making the organizers look foolish was a good thing in their opinion. Fleur could practically feel her husband's satisfaction as he flew along beside her. He, more than any of them, had the right to make a mockery of the tournament. It took less than 15 seconds to reach the cup in the center of the maze. The only potential obstacle was an acromantula of all things, but it was stuck behind another wall and would take some time to arrive if it had even seen them coming. The looks they exchanged made their opinions of this task utterly clear. Well, that was easy, grinned Cedric. Shall we? 3, 2, 1. Cedric had reached his hand out as he spoke, as did the rest of them. They had discussed this ahead of time. They wanted it to be a tie with no way for the judges to say otherwise. If they grabbed the cup at exactly the same time, then there would be no contest, no loopholes. And so they did. And then all hell broke loose. Whoever designed this task was a moron, Sirius noted, at least from a spectator's point of view. Here, was shouted back from various other spectators. And then fireworks shot up into the sky from the four corners of the maze, and the hedges began to crumble away. It was clearly an effect designed to signal the end of the competition, a self-cleaning maze he would have said in his youth, but something was wrong. In the center of the maze, where should have stood 4 champions with their brooms, was nothing more than a lone acromantula. What the? He breathed. His mirth vanished instantly, like someone had flipped a switch. Suddenly, he was deadly serious, his instincts screaming at him that something had just gone terribly wrong. Turning quickly, he scanned the area in front of the judges and saw nothing and nobody there either. Turning all the way around, he couldn't spot them anywhere. If the cup was a portkey or something, it hadn't taken them anywhere he could see. "Where are my children?" asked Ariane as it became clear that something was decidedly wrong. But that was all the time they had left to worry about their missing family members. People throughout the stadium were starting to scream, and it wasn't because the champions had gone missing. Whoever had designed and set up the maze and its disintegration had forgotten one key fact, that all of the various creatures would completely fail to disintegrate with the hedges. And with the champions having bypassed all of them, none of them had been eliminated beforehand. With no hedges to pen them in, The creatures were free to roam. Most of them were incredibly deadly, and all of them were unhappy. One acromantula had already started toward the stands, and, as luck would have it, was heading right at their section. Sirius quickly drew his wand and made his way down to the front. He was once an Auror and knew the drill. He was dimly aware of Sebastian and Hermione following him. It wasn't long at all before he was forced to behead the giant sentient spider. It was not for being shifted from its chosen prey. All around them, the place dissolved into utter chaos. Hagrid's Scroots were heading toward various points in the audience. A second acromantula was heading toward another part of the stands, and a manticore of all things had honed in on the judge's box. Toward the center of the maze, a lonely, disgruntled sphinx stood quietly and waited to see the upcoming carnage. And those were just the obvious threats. With a shake of his head, and working seamlessly with Sebastian and Hermione, Sirius focused in on the next threat and tried to ignore both the stampede of the spectators behind him and his worries over his missing godson and goddaughter-in-law. It was going to be a long night. Chapter 43, Anticlimax. Harry's nerves snapped taut when his hand seized up on the trophy's handle, his other locked around the shaft of his broom. He clearly felt the hook that yanked him away from the center of the maze. Every instinct he had was screaming at him that this was wrong. I knew it was too easy, he mentally groused. As the trip continued past the first second or two, he knew they weren't simply being transported to the judges. Wherever they were going, it was likely to be the point of the whole exercise. From the moment his name had been entered, there had been a purpose, and now they were going to learn what it was, possibly to their great cost. All he could do right now, though, was mentally tally the situation. He could feel his wife bumping against him on one side, and could see Victor and Cedric directly across, also carrying their brooms. This was a small comfort. Whatever was happening, it was likely that whoever was on the other end only expected one person, not four. A few moments later, they all hit the ground and went sprawling. "What the hell?" groused Cedric. Harry, however, wasn't listening. While he was helping Fleur to her feet, he was otherwise busy taking in their surroundings, and what he saw was far from promising. They were in a graveyard, likely miles and miles away from Hogwarts. A moldering old mansion was visible atop a hill in the distance, and an old church off to one side. But other than that, there was nothing but trees and grave markers as far as the eye could see. Well, that and an ominous fog clinging to the ground, like something out of a Muggle Halloween special. "This is not part of the tournament," noted Victor. "Non," agreed Fleur quietly. And then, showing that they were totally on the same page, she added, "Whatever this is, it must be why Harry was entered." "I agree," Harry said. "I don't see anyone else around, though." "They probably didn't expect us to be this fast," noted Cedric. "Let's get out of sight until we figure out what to do." There was no need for any further prompting. Cedric quickly took the lead, drawing them over to and then behind a sizable mausoleum. Harry could tell that he had thought of entering the structure, but decided against it. It didn't matter, though. What mattered was what was written on a headstone that Harry spotted in the distance. He couldn't take his eyes off of it. It spelled trouble with a capital T. "Harry?" prompted Fleur, finally dragging him almost forcibly back behind the mausoleum with the rest of them. "What EESET?" she asked nervously. "I know where we are," he said faintly. "Where?" asked Cedric. Harry turned to look Fleur in the eye, since she was the only one present likely to understand the full implications. "That house on the hill," he quietly gestured. "It's probably the Riddle estate." The other two champions were baffled, but Fleur's eyes widened, and her grip on him tightened. "You are certain?" she asked. "That's what one of the gravestones said." "I doubt it's a coincidence." Fleur let go and started cursing in French so fluently that Harry fancied he could almost literally see the air turning blue. "Whoa, slow down," put in Cedric. "Want to share with the class." What is the riddle estate, you said? Harry shook himself out of his daze, resigned to explaining things. He had no idea how long they would be alone, however, so he needed to be quick about it. There was no time to be gentle, as in Tom Marvolo Riddle. He told Cedric, with Victor listening in off to the side. He uses a different name these days. He got it by rearranging the letters until they said, "I am Lord Voldemort." Cedric and Victor both immediately lost all color. "Please tell me this is a joke," choked out Victor. "Non," said Fleur quietly but firmly. "ETES, no joke. We are in very great danger." "The question is, what do we do about it?" mused Harry. "I have no idea how to get us home." "Out of time," noted Victor. He was currently peering up the hill toward the house. "Someone is coming." It took Harry all of 10 seconds to figure it out. The brooms, he decided. We stay low behind the gravestones until whoever that is passes, then we get up in the air. Worst case, we fly away as fast as we can and make our way back to the school. He can't chase all of us at once, so if we're spotted, we split up. They all exchanged looks and then nodded their agreement. Nobody had a better idea and nothing else was said. Harry led the way this time, slaloming silently through the graveyard, his wife hot on his heels. He hoped the other two were there, as well not that he was worried about Crumb's chances on a broom. He wasn't worried about Fleur either. Truth be told, Cedric was actually the weakest flyer in the group, and he wasn't half bad in Harry's opinion. It took some doing and nearly 5 minutes of meticulous flying, but they slowly circled around the graveyard until they were behind the unknown party. Then Harry pulled up sharply, and they rapidly gained altitude, finally gathering directly overhead, nearly 100 feet up. Once on high, they could see that, in their hurry, they had overlooked the presence of an enormous cauldron. The unknown person was carrying something toward it. "What on earth?" asked Cedric. "Dark ritual," suggested Crumb. "If I had to guess," said Harry, "dark resurrection ritual." "Murd," breathed Fleur. "What now?" asked Cedric. And that was the million-galleon question. On one hand, Harry felt like they should run and not look back. Getting involved in this was only going to get someone hurt or killed. On the other hand, it was clear that Tom had a purpose here, and it probably involved having Harry present. Would he simply use someone else if Harry didn't show? It was highly likely. "We should stop, sis," said Fleur after a while. "I do not know what E is planning, but it cannot be good." Agreed Victor. "Dark rituals are never good. They'll hurt many people if we do not stop it." "This is he who must not be named we're talking about," shuddered Cedric. "Can we even stop him?" "Yes," said Harry flatly. "Tom is nothing more than a psychotic wizard. He's not a god. We can stun him just like anyone else. Just don't try to kill him." "What? Why not?" gasped Cedric. "He's a monster." "We," agreed Fleur quietly, "but he is a monster that has taken precautions. ETES, not that we do not want to kill EM. ETES, that we cannot kill EM. It will not end well." It was the thickening of her accent that clued Harry into just how calm Fleur was not, which otherwise did not come through in her voice. He quickly slid his broom closer to her and caught her in a one-armed hug. For all that she was a capable adult, she had never before been in a situation like this one. Neither had the other two, but that was neither here nor there. They weren't his wife. "Easy, love," he soothed. "It'll be fine. We have the advantage here. He only expected one of us, and he doesn't even know where we are, or maybe even that we're here yet." Fleur stared into his eyes for a long moment before suddenly grabbing his head and kissing him thoroughly, something she never did in public beyond a mere peck. "You will come home in one piece," she growled in French. "You hear me, husband?" Harry couldn't help but smile. "I do," he replied in the same language. "And the same goes for you, love." "Bon," she said finally, and then forced her mask back into place. He knew it to be an aspect of a clemency. She was using it to suppress her feelings and her nerves. Turning back to the graveyard, Harry quickly took in the situation. Whoever was down there had put the bundle down and appeared now to be tending something in the cauldron. Harry also spotted movement off to the side, something slithering through the underbrush nearby. Snake, he noted, pointing it out to the others. Not at Crumb. Big, too. Probably belongs to he who, agreed Cedric. Is that one we can kill? Noted Fleur grimly. She was clearly taking this all very personally. Silence reigned as they studied the area. There was a town off in the distance, but it was unlikely to be of any help. The unknown person tending the cauldron was the only human visible for miles. The only other party they could see was the snake. You know, this could be relatively simple, Harry finally said. Then, looking at Crumb, he suggested, Ronsky faint, attack at the bottom, right before we pull up. A smile slowly spread across Victor's face. Harry'd had little contact with him since the Yule Ball, but he had seemed fairly boring then. Now, though, with that look in his eye, Harry understood. Crumb found his fun in the air. He said slowly, You take the snake, suggested Harry. That might actually be the more difficult one. Use a cutting hex. I'll deal with our unknown down there, with a stunner. What about us? Asked Cedric, motioning between himself and Fleur. Back up, explained Victor. Exactly, agreed Harry, looking Cedric in the eye. If something happens to us, it's up to you to save the day. Then, with an amused smirk, he added, I'd ask you to get Fleur to safety, but I don't feel like being charbroiled. Bon, smirked Fleur. You are learning. They all had a good chuckle over that, but Harry felt their time was up now. They needed to get this done before something else could happen. All right, let's go, he decided. And then he and Victor lined up on their respective firebolts. Good luck, he told Victor. Same, Victor replied. 3, 2, 1, and they were off. Harry forgot all his fears in the rush of air on his face as he streaked toward the ground, dimly aware of Victor doing the same right beside him. If this had been a Quidditch game, it would have been immensely fun. But then the moment was over, and he raised his wand, poised to strike. They crossed the distance in less than 5 seconds, and Harry roared his curse into the night, even as Victor did the same. Stupefy! Rizaka! Harry's curse slammed into the back of the person tending the cauldron, slamming his head into it with a resounding clang. Even as Harry pulled out of his dive, however, he heard Victor's curse having a very unexpected effect, and forcefully yanked the broom around to see what had happened. He was just in time to see an image of Voldemort screaming into the night as it disintegrated into nothingness where it hovered over the headless body of the snake that Victor had targeted. Victor swore in his native language. That, he asked as he landed with a thud. Just be glad it's gone, said Harry quietly, choosing not to answer the question. He had a guess, and really didn't want knowledge of that topic to spread. Instead, he also landed, and then turned to the unknown person and pulled its hood down. Wormtail, he growled upon recognizing the idiot. He looked up and was just about to motion Cedric and Fleur down from the heavens when heard something that made his blood run cold. Avada Kedavra! Fleur watched silently as her husband of 3 months lined up next to an internationally renowned Quidditch star like it was no big thing. One would have thought that he flew with the famous Victor Crumb every day, and that was to say nothing of what awaited them at the bottom of their respective dives. She had tremendous confidence in Harry, but that did not stop her from worrying over his safety. If whoever was down there saw them coming, it could get very ugly, very quickly. She could only hope that their presence truly was still unknown. 3, 2, 1. The look on his face as he dove was unsurprising to her. He adored flying, and if not for the fame aspect, she would have recommended Quidditch as a potential career. He was, by all accounts, an excellent seeker. She saw as the spells flashed out, and then came the most unearthly shriek she'd ever heard. It sent shivers up her spine, and she had no idea what had caused it. Unlike Harry, she had never heard that sound before. "What was that?" asked Cedric nervously. "I do not know," she shrugged. But they do not seem to be worried about it. She watched as Harry went over and examined the unknown person, but was quickly distracted. Her heart nearly stopped when a sickly green spell flashed out from the bundle on the ground, very nearly striking Crumb in the back. He was barely able to dive out of the way. She was in her own dive before she even consciously registered what she was doing. By the time Fleur reached the ground, however, it was already over. Harry had quickly stunned whoever was in the bundle, and was now staring at it with a deeply disgusted expression on his face. She quickly landed and looked for herself and promptly wished that she hadn't. It was all she could do to keep her dinner down. "That is disgusting," she snapped, even as Cedric touched down next to her. "I think it's Tom," said Harry faintly. "I have no idea what he did to himself, but yeah, that's disgusting." "Homunculus," said Crumb as he brushed himself off. "AM surprised it can cast." "Looked like it almost got you," noted Cedric. "Duh," agreed Victor. "Lucky I was paying attention." "Who is the Eozer?" asked Fleur curiously. "Pettigrew," explained Harry darkly. "He's not going anywhere." Fleur had the sense that it was over. There was nobody else about, and as creepy as their surroundings were, they were now relatively safe. She could see that Harry was holding something back, but she would ask him later. "What now?" asked Cedric. "Now you go to the ministry and find Madame Bones," ordered Harry. "Get her here with a gob of horrors, and whoever else she needs to deal with Riddle and Pettigrew. Oh, and tell her I said that Gringotts needs to be involved. There's something here they're looking for, and you don't want to get in their way on that one. We'll be here when you get back." Cedric blinked in shock at Harry's decisive orders, but quickly shook himself out of it. Right, he nodded. He closed his eyes for a moment to center himself, and then he suddenly twisted and vanished with a crack. Fleur couldn't help staring hungrily at Harry. His take-charge attitude just then did funny things to her insides. He blinked back at her in shock when he spotted it, and that brought her back to herself. She gave him a look that promised many things that night, and then moved off to start cataloging what was here. There really wasn't much to see. The cauldron had some sort of liquid in it, but she wouldn't have been surprised if it was little more than water. There was no smell, which supported that possibility. The thing had a base that allowed for firewood to be placed underneath, but there was none present. She wasn't sure if that meant the ritual would have taken place elsewhere, or if they just hadn't started it yet. Harry had Pettigrew trussed up like a Christmas turkey alongside it, and the bump on his head doubly ensured that he wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. On the other side of the cauldron, the massive snake now, headless, lay cooling in the grass. It was positively enormous. Good thing they had decided to target it, or things might have been far worse. "That was a Horcrux," said Victor suddenly, his voice hushed and laced with clear disgust. "In the snake." Fleur's gaze snapped to Victor at the same time as Harry's did. She had no idea what to say. While they had not been sworn to secrecy, this was not the sort of knowledge that should be shared. Harry took the initiative, though. "Yes," he said flatly, "but please don't ever repeat that. Nobody needs to know that Tom made them. The goblins are dealing with it, and if this really is him, then he'll be dead for good very shortly." "Good," nodded Crumb. "Is that what that shriek was?" she asked curiously. "Duh," nodded Victor. "Looked like him, too." Fleur could do little more than blink in surprise. This was turning out to be a very productive night. Her only complaint was that they could have stopped it all if they'd gone after Riddle as soon as they knew he was present. Then again, how would they have known that he was little more than a homunculus? Giving up that train of thought with a heavy sigh, she leaned her broom against a headstone and wrapped herself around her husband from behind. The adrenaline was already leaving her system, and she was definitely feeling the effects. She rested her chin on his head, and as she closed her eyes, she saw Crumb smiling softly at them. She hadn't known he was capable of that. Harry wanted to close his eyes and melt into Fleur's embrace, but would not allow himself to do so. They were still in hostile territory. He doubted there would be further trouble, but one never knew. For one thing, he suspected that there was another Horcrux somewhere nearby. If it was alive like the snake was, then there was no telling what could happen. 10 minutes later, Harry was getting worried. Cedric had been gone for quite a while, and there were still no Aurors on the scene. He could feel Fleur's tension once more increasing through the grip she had on him. And even Crumb was starting to look fidgety. Could something have gone wrong? Another 10 minutes after that, and all three of them were considering leaving the scene together to try to get help. They were deeply worried that something might have happened to Cedric. As such, they were all on a razor's edge when help finally arrived. It took all of Harry's considerable self-control to prevent himself from casting a stunner at Amelia Bones when she appeared in the graveyard, and with his recent power boost, it would have been one hell of a stunner indeed. Her aura robes looked like she'd already been through a war tonight. They were singed and ripped in places, and on closer inspection, he could see that there was dirt streaked across her face. The auras she brought with her weren't much better off. "Mr. Potter," she called. "What exactly happened?" Harry blinked. "I could ask the same of you." He frowned. "Are you all right?" "We're fine, Mr. Potter," she sighed. "I'll explain in a minute. You first, please." Harry studied her for a moment longer before finally relenting and explaining what had happened. Cedric returned halfway through the explanation with a familiar pair of goblins in tow, causing him to have to start over again. He supposed he shouldn't have been surprised that Riptooth and Ragnarok were both taking a personal interest. By the time he finished the story, most of the newcomers were in shock. Only Bones and the goblins had taken it with any level of equanimity. "Quite the night," said Ragnarok in his gravelly voice, nodding in respect to Harry. "We will scan for what we require." Turning to Madame Bones, he added, "The rest is yours. The people take no interest outside of certain artifacts." Madame Bones took that in stride. "I'm aware of your interest," she admitted, "and I have no intention of stopping you. All I ask is that you let me know when they've all been found." Then, eyeing Harry, she added, "Or at least let Mr. Potter know." Ragnarok chuckled. "That will not be a problem, Madame Bones. He is, after all, the one who alerted our employee to their existence." Harry couldn't help but chuckle. More my wife and her mom, but that's neither here nor there. He grinned, but then he turned serious again. "So that's here, Madame Bones. What happened to you?" Her grimace was not reassuring. She took a moment to direct her people to start dealing with the scene, and then conjured a chair to sit down in. The champions followed suit, and Fleur also conjured a pair of chairs for the two goblins. Harry would have, but he wasn't that good at it yet. What happened was a cock-up of massive proportions on the part of the tournament organizers. "Mr. Potter," she finally sighed. Harry blinked at that description. "You mean beyond having a task that involved the spectators watching hedges grow for an hour or so?" Both goblins roared with laughter at that question, and Madame Bones rolled her eyes. "Unfortunately, yes," she said. "Those hedges were spelled to self-disintegrate when the cup was taken." The first stirrings of horror made themselves known deep in Harry's gut, and could almost feel the blood draining from his cheeks. "Please tell me that they had the creatures locked in place," he said quietly. "Unfortunately, no," she replied. Nobody was killed, but it was a close run thing. There were numerous serious injuries. If not for your godfather and father-in-law and a student named Hermione Granger, things would be quite a lot worse. They managed to subdue all but the Manticore, with only scattered help from others, most notably the Weasley twins. It took Dumbledore, Karkaroff, Maxime, and Mad-Eye all working together just to contain the Manticore. We had to help them take it down. Zir was a Manticore in Zat Maze, asked Fleur faintly. What were they thinking? Did not sign up as a sacrifice, growled Crumb darkly. You're not the only ones saying such things, nodded Madame Bones. Manticores are illegal for a reason, and the Triwizard Tournament did not rate an exemption, nor did it have one. I have people looking into the records, and whoever is behind that will face the full force of the law. I consider it 4 counts of attempted murder at an absolute minimum. The only thing worse would have been a basilisk. Harry couldn't help but agree. He knew enough about manticores from reading ahead in Care of Magical Creatures to know that they were utterly deadly. As Madame Bones had said, there was a reason they were illegal. A single manticore could have killed a sizable percentage of the audience before they could take it down. They were lucky that it hadn't. Are my parents all right? Worried Fleur. And Aries' godfather and Hermione? Yes, they're fine, nodded Amelia. All of them have minor injuries, but nothing serious. I think Granger might be up for an Order of Merlin, too. She spotted one of those Merlin-bedamned scruts targeting a group of Wisingamot members and managed to stop it with some dramatic transfiguration at the cost of getting slightly mauled by a rampaging hippogriff. Your godfather managed to divert the hippogriff before it could do worse. Shaking her head, she added, and she still kept going after that, even though she was obviously in pain. I'm hoping to recruit her when she graduates. She would make an excellent Auror. Good luck with that, chuckled Harry. I don't know what she has planned in the long run, but I can't see her as an Auror. None, agreed Fleur. A teacher or a researcher per APS, but she is too, do you say black and white? For law enforcement. Agreed, Crumb. Department of Mysteries for that one. Cedric agreed. She's certainly smart enough. We'll see what happens, chuckled Amelia. In the meantime, we need to get you back to Hogwarts. My people can handle things from here. Chapter 44 Aftermath. When the champions arrived back at Hogwarts, they expected to be set upon by headmasters, reporters, and who knows who else. What they got, however, was something quite different. In lieu of the expected chaos, they were beset with worried family members, most of whom were slightly singed, probably by the blast-ended scruts. Hermione, with her arm trussed up in a sling, couldn't stifle her snort when she spotted them. Figures, she grumbled, as perfectly coiffed as ever. Fleur would have taken that badly from anyone else, but Hermione was truly a friend, and it was quite amusing. She couldn't help her giggle. Sorry, Hermione, she smiled. Next time we can, how do you say, swap? You may deal with Tom Z next time instead. Hermione blinked hard at that. Wait, what? She asked. Long story, said Harry dismissively. We'll fill you in later. Important bits right now. Tom and Pettigrew are in custody and not going anywhere. Duh, said Victor, having escaped his parents to sneak up beside Fleur. That's not exciting, he added. Heard you veer Veriervoman, though. Fleur couldn't help but grin at Hermione's deep blush. It wasn't that big of a deal, the girl groused. Just caged up the scruts is all. And got mauled by a hippogriff, Harry reminded her, giving her a look that told her he was on to her. Hermione just rolled her eyes. Did I hear you correctly? Sebastian finally asked. You caught Riddle. Oui, nodded Fleur. Madame Bones, as it in, and a collective breath of relief escaped most of the adults. I guess we know who entered you now, noted Sirius. Probably wanted you for his return party or something. Yeah, but how? Asked Harry. I suppose he could have sent Pettigrew to put my name in, but it just doesn't add up. That is a very good point, frowned Fleur. And it really was. She had heard both Harry and Sirius talk about Pettigrew. He was, by all accounts, only a marginal wizard, and it was questionable whether he could manage to alter the goblet sufficiently to make it spit out 4 names. Not impossible he was an animagus, which was difficult but still questionable. Bones will probably dose the rat with Veritaserum, Sirius finally said. She'll learn that and more, and then we'll have all the answers we need. The group kibitzed for a while longer, but it soon became apparent that the headmasters and tournament officials wouldn't be available anytime soon. The aftermath was going to take a long while to deal with. They all said their goodnights as a result, and Fleur took the opportunity to drag her husband back to their suite in the carriage. They didn't even make it all the way to the bed before she proceeded to ravish him, and with an unusual level of aggression, she simply couldn't help but feel after the events of the night. He certainly wasn't complaining, though. The following morning saw them trudging back to the castle, both still tired after spending most of the night doing anything but sleeping. Tom's capture was a huge deal, and they were riding high on the thought that it was almost over. Only Dumbledore remained as a threat, and he would be dealt with soon enough. Of course, nothing could go that smoothly. They barely made it halfway up the aisle next to the Gryffindor table when a voice behind them growled out the curse that she had heard started far too often over the course of the last few months. Avada Kedavra! Much as it had at Snape's trial, the world slowed to a crawl. Fleur knew instinctively who the target would be, but her instantaneous assessment told her that pushing him out of the way wasn't going to work. Instead, she summoned a thankfully empty platter from an adjacent table, putting a massive amount of power into it in her hurry, even as she started to spin around. True to her prediction, the sickly green bolt of the killing curse sped toward Harry's back. He also reacted and was diving to the floor, but without intervention, he wasn't going to make it. The platter, however, was on course, and only moments later intercepted the curse before it could hit him, shattering into 1,000 tiny shards in the process. Fleur was hardly done. However, she continued her spin, and even before she could register shock over who the caster had been cast, a powerful stunner right back at him. It nailed him between the eyes, and with such force that it flipped him completely over the table behind him to land in a heap on the floor. And time resumed its normal course. True to form, Harry hit the ground rolling and came up with his wand in hand, but the situation was already resolved. "Are you okay?" he asked into the ringing silence. Fleur nearly choked. "Am I okay?" she asked archly. "You were Z target, mon amour." "I am just fine." Harry blinked. "Oh," he said. "You got him?" "Oui," she nodded. Then she frowned. E.T. was moody. What? The upside to the mess was that the headmaster was still at the ministry answering for last night's ruckus. Bones was quickly summoned, and they promptly discovered how Harry's name had gotten into the goblet. Moody was not, in fact, Moody, but instead a polyjuiced Death Eater named Barty Crouch. Jr., he had acted now because he heard from Bones that his master had been captured, and decided on his own that Potter had to be punished permanently. Fleur remembered Crouch Sr. from the early days of the tournament, and wondered how he was involved, but that was soon answered, along with his terminal fate at the hand of his own son. As for the real Moody, he was recovered alive from the depths of his own trunk in the defense office. Harry just shook his head and grumbled about being taught by yet another Death Eater, and wondered if the real Moody would have been better or worse. The most significant outcome of the event, which wouldn't be noticed for some time, yet was how it changed everyone's perception of Fleur. She was already regarded as a deadly opponent when riled, but that was due to her Vila heritage. The incident with the fake Moody, right there in front of everyone, proved once and for all that she was also extremely formidable as a witch. It would go on to be described as a deadly ballet, her moves having appeared more like she was dancing than fighting. Fleur was endlessly amused by this. While she did know how to dance, all she had actually done was turn around quickly and cast a couple of spells. It was more down to quick thinking than anything else. On top of that, their nonchalance in the aftermath presented a certain image, and everyone in the castle ran with it. The Potters would find it highly amusing in the future, and were certainly not complaining. Harry and Fleur managed to avoid Dumbledore for the next 2 days, though that was probably because he was away at the Ministry attempting to run damage control. The Daily Prophet had run a series of articles over those days that painted him in a very bad light. They were questioning a great many things, but nothing so much as his running of Hogwarts. His defense of Snape and Malfoy in court was really coming back to bite him in the arse. Snape could be left aside as an error in judgment, but nobody could understand why Dumbledore had bothered to attempt to defend the Malfoy heir. While Draco was young, he was easily old enough to know better and certainly old enough to understand what the term unforgivable curse actually meant and why it was called that. He had tried to kill another student in front of everybody in the Great Hall of Hogwarts, and had done so without the slightest hint of remorse. He had also claimed afterwards, including on the stand, that he would keep trying until he succeeded. It was eminently clear that the boy was a lost cause, and was irredeemably evil, and Dumbledore had defended him. Then you added on to that the mess that the Triwizard Tournament had become a mess that he was largely responsible for, at least on paper, and it was no wonder that he was in trouble. He was likely cashing in every favor he could just to stay out of a DMLE holding cell. While those 2 Dumbledore-free days were a blessed relief, though, they knew it was just a matter of time. And sure enough, they were visited by McGonagall at lunch on the 3rd day. She was clearly unhappy to be the messenger on this occasion. "Mr. Potter," she said quietly, "the headmaster would like to see you in his office." Harry just sighed. "Fine," he groused, "but you're coming with us, Professor. We won't be in a room alone with that bastard." If McGonagall thought his statement inappropriate, she utterly failed to show it. She simply followed along with the Potters as they made their way to his office. Fleur was sure this wouldn't end well. Dealing with Albus Dumbledore never did. Fawkes appeared on Harry's shoulder halfway there. Neither Potter even blinked at that, to McGonagall's obvious surprise. And Dumbledore was clearly perturbed when he received 3 visitors, 4, if you counted Fawkes instead of the one he was expecting. "I'm sorry, but this is a private meeting," he began seriously. "Minerva, please escort Miss Delacour back to the Beauxbatons facilities." Fleur was incensed. She was certain he was ignoring their marriage on purpose just to be insulting. And she was done with it. "Madam McGonagall," she called, "I would suggest that you take this man to your hospital immediately." EETEES clears that his memory EES, not what ET should be. "I would be very worried about him if I were you. He may be suffering from some form of what is the word?" "Dementia," supplied Harry helpfully. "And I agree. His memory is extremely spotty, and that's a very bad sign." "I assure you, my memory is as sharp as ever," frowned Dumbledore. "Really?" retorted Harry. "Then why is it that you so consistently fail to remember that Fleur and I are married, and that my wife is properly addressed as Mrs. or Madam Potter, not Miss Delacour?" "Now, Harry, surely," Mr. Potter corrected Harry. "You are my former headmaster, nothing more, and I have never given you leave to be so familiar with me. And I'm still waiting for an answer. Why do you keep forgetting that Fleur and I are married? Because either your memory is going, or you're deliberately insulting us. There are far more important matters." "None, zero are not," Fleur interrupted. "You simply have no defense for your behavior, so you try to change the subject." Turning to Harry, she added, "I do not see why we should even listen to him, mon amour." He is nuzzing mores on an obnoxious old man, with, how do you say, delusions of grandeur, I think. Harry snorted. Appropriate, and I agree. Turning back, he stared down a shocked headmaster. We're done, Dumbledore, he said flatly. I am no longer your student, and you have no authority over me. Neither of us ever wants to speak with you again. So leave us the hell alone, or you won't like the consequences. Harry then turned to McGonagall and tipped his hat. Professor, he nodded, and then they departed, leaving behind an absolutely flabbergasted Albus Dumbledore with a surprisingly amused Minerva McGonagall. Dumbledore continued to hound them for the next couple of days, to Harry's immense frustration. Notes were frequently delivered by the house elves demanding not asking, demanding that he come to the headmaster's office. Harry ignored these. The man had no right. Multiple teachers were also roped in, though each of them only tried it once. Harry made it very clear, albeit politely, that they were being used in a campaign of harassment against a former student. The majority of those teachers ended up tearing strips off of Dumbledore afterwards, not that Harry knew that. Several students had been corralled into Dumbledore's schemes as well, though that quickly stopped when the student body realized that neither Potter was on speaking terms with the man. Nobody wanted to be on their bad side, and that was doubly true among the student population. Such feelings were reinforced by the article that had appeared on the heels of their last meeting with him, proclaiming that a certain Dark Lord was being detained by the Department of Mysteries, having been caught by the Potters. To their surprise, Cedric and Crumb were amused that the article ignored their presence and had no issue with it. Harry disagreed, but there was nothing he could do bar telling people what really happened. Dumbledore's attempts to contact them finally stopped 2 days after their meeting, because the man suddenly had far bigger issues. This was made public by the Daily Prophet that very same day. Albus Dumbledore charged with grand theft, caught pilfering from Potter Estate by R. Giles. The past few months have brought shocking insight into Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, defeater of the Dark Wizard Grindelwald, Grand Sorcerer Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, and current Headmaster of Hogwarts. He has been seen to defend Severus Snape, Death Eater and convicted child abuser, and Draco Malfoy, who attempted to murder the boy who lived right in front of him, has had multiple dust-ups with the up-and-coming Potter family, and was recently thrown out of Gringotts Bank in London. But what is really happening? How is it that one of the greatest wizards of our time is having so many problems, both real and imagined? How is it all related? The Daily Prophet now has that answer. A recent filing with the British Wizengamot initiated a charge of grand theft against Albus Dumbledore. The brief states that Dumbledore willfully misappropriated over 80 million galleons from the Potter estate, funneling them into an organization known as the Order of the Phoenix, which those in the know say was originally formed to fight against he who must not be named. Dumbledore is registered as Harry Potter's financial guardian, but the brief indicates that Potter recently arrived at Gringotts none the wiser and was accosted by the goblins over a perceived slight. To placate them, he was given Veritaserum and admitted under the influence that he knew nothing of his inheritance beyond a small trust vault. He was not even aware that Dumbledore was involved in his estate until it was discovered by Sebastian Delacour. It is likely that this is the reason that Dumbledore has been denied access to goblin lands. As many will know, the goblins deal particularly harshly with thieves, and especially with those who use their good relations with the goblins to accomplish their misdeeds. In light of this, it is unlikely that Dumbledore will ever again see the inside of the bank. Account manager Riptooth, the manager for the Potter estate, informed us Thursday that the notes in the brief are, in fact, accurate. He further informed us that Harry James Potter, Fleur Annalise Potter, and Sebastian and Ariane Delacour have all been named friends of the Goblin Nation. When we asked after the reasons, he had this to say: Mr. Potter was exceptionally understanding about our mistake in accusing him of the sins of Albus Dumbledore. He has always been respectful to goblins, and shows none of the usual prejudice of wizard kind. His wife and her family are likewise enlightened, and we are proud to call them friends. The discovery of the theft is sure to explain the frequent altercations between the Potters and Albus Dumbledore. While they have made no public statement regarding the charges, those charges were filed by Potter's father-in-law, Sebastian Delacour. It is believed that Mr. Delacour is playing a large role in the prosecution on behalf of young Mr. Potter. A date has not yet been set for the trial, but the brief reports that the embezzled funds had been reclaimed by the goblins under existing goblin law. Given that they are known for their honesty in financial dealings, that is as good as pronouncing Dumbledore guilty as charged. Harry snorted as he read the article. "Looks like we're up and coming now," he said sarcastically. Fleur smirked evilly, and in a throaty voice she replied, "As long as ETESU Zat is up and me Zat is coming, I think I can live with Zat." Half the students within earshot choked on whatever they were eating or drinking, Harry included. Chapter 45 winners and losers Albus Dumbledore was missing in action for the days following the announcement of the charges. Nobody was certain if he was just busy running damage control, or if it was out of shame that he failed to appear at meals. The near confirmation of the theft that the Gringotts statement represented had left him bereft of respect in what he surely considered to be his castle. The Potters counted their blessings. The less they saw of the old criminal, the better as far as they were concerned. Life for the students was also surprisingly quiet in the wake of the third task. Investigations were ongoing, and various officials could be seen prowling around the school and interviewing various people, but the students were largely exempt. The school officials, however, were not having a good time. The papers were reporting the occasional result, but so far there had been little of interest. Most felt that the ministry was withholding whatever they found, so they could pull a big reveal when it was all said and done. The result of the investigation into the presence of the manticore, however, did leak, and it had borne unexpected fruit. While Bagman was aware of the illegality and thus was arrested, it was a woman named Dolores Umbridge who actually arranged the acquisition and delivery of the beast. When questioned, she admitted that she wanted the half-blood and creature abominations dead, and assumed that the respectable pureblood champions could deal with the beast once it killed them. Umbridge was a bigot of the First Order, and responsible for a great many bigoted laws in magical Britain and not a few murders besides. Needless to say, she was now in Azkaban and no longer advising Fudge. But that was, in the end, the only juicy tidbit that the students had access to. Everything else was being kept quiet. Would Dumbledore be charged? Would the other school heads face sanctions of any kind? What about the ministry officials involved? There were no answers forthcoming, and so it wasn't long before the students started asking a different question that nobody had bothered with as yet. With no new information being shared, the discussion soon tapered off, and they moved on to the more obvious topic. This had been the last task of the Triwizard Tournament, hadn't it? They knew by now what had gone on in the graveyard, and they saw the run-up to the disaster, but they didn't know the most critical factor of the tournament. Who won? It wasn't until almost a week after the task ended that the ministry finally got around to providing the answer, rather than make a massive public spectacle. However, they wisely decided to hold the event after an extra feast at Hogwarts. This would allow them to limit the media coverage, or so the hope went. It was quite surprising to see Dumbledore once more riding his gaudy throne at the staff table. On the surface, he seemed as serene as ever, but the more astute among them noted the anger in his eyes whenever he looked at the Potters. It was also clear that even his own staff was giving him a wide berth. Harry wondered how long it would be before the Board of Governors ousted him, especially given that he'd lost them their most famous student. Maxime and Karkaroff made sure that there were several people between them and him at the head table. It was clear to everyone that they were refusing to be tarred with the same brush. It would not do to be seen supporting a thief. On the other side of Dumbledore sat Minister Fudge, Madame Bones, and to Harry's surprise, Augusta Longbottom. The latter was temporarily appointed to the chief of the Wisengamot slot after Dumbledore was summarily suspended due to his upcoming trial and most expected that to become permanent. It was good to see Fudge finally surrounding himself with competent people. For tonight's festivities, the champions sat with their families. Harry and Fleur were at the Gryffindor table, as was expected these days. They spent an enjoyable evening chatting with the Delacours and Sirius, along with Hermione, Neville, and the Weasley twins. And boy, were the twins glad they hadn't interfered with the task. They had never come up with anything to do, but if they had done anything, they could have become targets as scapegoats for all the trouble. A number of highly ranked people had ended up in St. Mungo's, and they were all out for blood. Fred and George wanted nothing to do with that. As dinner wound down, Filch pushed a podium up in front of the house tables, and Fudge quickly made his way down. Silence spread through the hall upon seeing it. Everyone wanted to know who truly won the tournament. Harry and Fleur just grinned at each other. "Good evening," gushed the minister. "Now that we've all enjoyed this lovely feast, it's time to get to the important things. You've all been patient, and we can now announce the results of the Triwizard Tournament." Polite applause went up at this declaration, though Fudge seemed slightly discouraged that it wasn't greater. It was hardly surprising. While everyone wanted to know who won, they were also all too aware that the tournament was, overall, a joke. As spectators, they'd seen very little beyond the first task, and the third task sent them running for the hills. "It seems we have a very unusual situation," Fudge continued after the applause died down. "As everyone saw, our champions decided to work together in the last task, summoning their brooms and avoiding the maze entirely. Rather smart of them, I say." The room laughed at this declaration. Everyone had seen the Manticore, and not a single person in the room would have wanted to face it alone or felt capable of it. Had the champions gone into the maze, it was highly likely that more than one of them would not have come back out. Given that the judges were unable to see what transpired due to the unfortunate events that followed, we were forced to take and view memories from each of the champions. What we saw astonished even me. I never would have predicted it. Fudge drew the silence out for a moment, watching as the students hung on his every word. It was clear that he hadn't gotten to be minister by bribery alone. He actually did have at least some small amount of charisma when he chose to employ it. "Our champions worked through the entire task as a team," he finally said, "and they ended it in a perfect tie, all taking the Triwizard Cup at exactly the same time." The applause that rose at this was startling in volume, though there was also a fair amount of laughter. Many of the students realized that the champions had, in the end, truly made a mockery of the competition, and it was clear from the satisfied look on Fudge's face that he was perfectly all right with that. It was probably because he could pass the blame on to everybody but himself. He was barely taking a hit, and much of what had happened as a result of the tournament was boosting his popularity in other ways. It was Dumbledore who was taking most of the blame. "Champions, come on up here," he requested. Harry sighed and stood, offering his hand to Fleur as he went. She quickly took it, and they were met in front of the podium by Cedric and Victor. Cedric stood to one side of the Potters, and Victor to the other. Only a few noticed that by silent mutual agreement, Cedric and Victor stood a step behind them. It was a subtle but nevertheless powerful statement of their opinion on the matter of the tournament. Never before in history have living contestants tied the Triwizard Tournament, Fudge informed his audience. After much discussion, we have decided that all 4 of these wonderful young people deserve the full award. Thus, we present each with 1,000 galleons and their very own Triwizard Cup. The audience roared their approval, and Harry and Fleur took their trophies, which contained bags of galleons with nearly identical eye rolls. Neither of them cared about any of it. They would decide much later, however, that the trophies would be displayed in a prominent location in their home, simply as a reminder of how their relationship began. And thus concludes the Triwizard Tournament. We hope you all enjoyed it, and that you made new friends with your fellow students in our visiting schools. Harry and Fleur couldn't help but chuckle at that as they escaped back to their table. They had no idea who all had noticed, but the champions were the only people who made friends at the opposing schools, and then only barely Harry and Fleur's marriage notwithstanding. The tournament was a complete failure in all respects in their view. The only question was whether it would ever be held again, but they both doubted it. With the exception of some of the fallout, it would likely be old news before this time next year. The canceling of the Hogwarts Quidditch season was, in the end, more impactful than the tournament itself. To most people, at least, Harry and Fleur felt differently, of course. Nobody was surprised when the following day's Daily Prophet announced that Hermione Granger was to be awarded the Order of Merlin, 2nd class. She was one of only a few students who stayed to corral the dangerous beasts that had been within the maze. And she was the only one to have made a truly significant impact on that effort. Some enterprising individual, probably Colin Creevey, had managed to snap a wizarding photograph of her dramatic transfiguration, as Madame Bones had put it. It was admittedly quite impressive. She had managed to transfigure a massive iron cage out of the front wall of one of the stands. As everybody knew, it took tremendous concentration to transfigure something so impressively large that and absolute bucket loads of power. Draco Malfoy would have been absolutely terrified that a Muggleborn was so much more powerful than him, had he been there to see it. None of the other usual suspects in the school had made so much as a peep in her direction since the incident either. The fact that she had done this to save a number of Wisengamot members, and while fleeing a rampaging hippogriff at that, had secured her the award with room to spare. The only complaint anyone had was that some felt it should have been a first-class award, though even Hermione herself disagreed with that. When asked in later years, she said it was the first time she ever truly appreciated the way Harry felt about that sort of attention. For her part, Hermione continued to claim she was just caging them up a bit, like it was no big deal. Harry had to stifle a laugh every time she said something similar. She had spent so much time snorting and rolling her eyes at him for downplaying his own efforts in the past that he found it hilariously funny. Turnabout is fair play, and all of that. The ceremony was to be held in the early days of the summer, and Harry and Fleur promised to be there with her, to her relief. Meanwhile, the paper also continued ripping on the tournament organizers, which mostly meant Bagman, Crouch, and Surprise Albus Dumbledore. Few had known that the entire thing had been his idea in the first place. His reputation was truly in tatters, and it was only getting worse for him. And then there was Percy Weasley, who was summarily sacked. When Crouch went missing, his son imperioused him into sending notes to Percy to execute on, and had Percy stuck to that, he would have been fine, since he had no way of knowing what was happening with his boss. But when those notes stopped coming, Percy said nothing, and simply took over the department without so much as a by your leave. He was lucky they couldn't find a crime to charge him with. To quote Amelia Bones, "It's not a crime to be a fool." In another shocking announcement, Ludo Bagman, who had already been arrested over the Manticore, turned out to be deeply in debt to the goblins. In an unprecedented move, the minister turned him over to Gringotts to face their form of justice. He wasn't about to pay Bagman's debts, which was the only other real option, since the man was a ministry employee. Nobody would ever hear of Bagman again, and they would have been shocked to learn that he had been exiled to the Americas rather than outright killed. As for the rest, the paper spent many, many words lambasting the Triwizard Tournament as a whole. The tournament had been sold to the nations involved as a way to improve international relations through some friendly competition. Nowhere in that discussion had anyone mentioned that the tournament would be potentially deadly to their most promising students. On the Bulgarian side, their champion, who was also an internationally renowned sports star, had nearly been maimed in the first task, and, according to rumor anyway, nearly killed in the third. Everybody was aware that the loss of Victor Crumb as their rising star would have been a huge blow to national pride. Cedric Diggory had actually been maimed in the first task, and was lucky they had been able to repair the damage. While he was far from famous like Victor, he was still well respected, and his father was well known in the ministry. They had come very close to losing a highly promising young man. And then there were Fleur and Harry. While recognizing that they were truly good together, and that their marriage would likely bring them much happiness, the media nevertheless ripped everyone to shreds for seeing two so young forced into marriage. The tournament organizers, they said, should have known better than to deliberately place Avila in life-threatening danger. The issue with Vila magic and life debts was quite well known, and that the tournament allowed a Vila competitor was seen as a travesty, not because Avila was unworthy to compete, but because it was so easy to ruin said Vila's life. It was seen as a major miracle that Harry and Fleur had come out of it with a bright future. The fallout from that series of articles very nearly saw Madame Maxime summarily sacked from the Beauxbatons Academy. The people of France, including several local Vila enclaves, were very upset that Fleur had been so thoroughly endangered. Had they ever learned of the mild coercion that Maxime had undertaken to talk Fleur into signing up, she wouldn't have lasted 2 seconds. Only a heartfelt public plea by the Potters that summer would stop the movement to have her ousted. They would ensure that everyone knew, firstly, that the headmistress had accepted responsibility and sincerely apologized at the first opportunity, which she had just after the wedding, and secondly, that the selection of the tasks was out of her hands. She hadn't known what they would entail when Fleur signed up. People would still grumble that she shouldn't have let a vulnerable Vila compete, but thanks to the Potters' intervention, the matter would finally be dropped, and Maxime would keep her job. But that was for the summer. Karkaroff, for his part, came through almost unscathed to Harry's disgust. He thought the man deserved far worse. The one most pilloried, however, to nobody's particular surprise, was Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, and mostly for the danger into which he'd placed Britain's precious boy, who lived. At first he was lambasted for his lacking security around the goblet, and then for his lacking common sense when assisting with determining what the tasks would be. But then the unthinkable occurred. One enterprising reporter obtained a copy of the original tournament rules, or rather, Amelia Bones sent them after accidentally discovering them during the investigation, though not even the reporter would ever learn that. It quickly became clear just how great Dumbledore's transgression had truly been. 2 factors were in play. First, the magic of the goblet, bound to those original rules even today, was based on the laws of magical oaths and contracts, and that branch of magic had very specific requirements. Put simply, nobody could force another person into an oath or a contract. If they could, the result would be chaos and the probable collapse of magical society as people began writing all manner of forced contracts for any number of nefarious purposes. That meant that, in spite of Dumbledore and Crouch's proclamations, Harry was never actually bound to compete in the first place. Upon reading that particular article, Harry had nearly cursed his former headmaster right then and there. Fortunately, he had far more sense and far more self-control than did Draco Malfoy. The second factor was that there was a proviso for canceling the tournament in case of a problem. Even had Harry somehow been bound to the contract, the judges could merely have declared the tournament over and then restarted it to draw new contestants, and nobody's magic would have been at risk. In light of this, that Harry was forced to compete was nothing short of a crime. And it was a crime that fell solely on Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. He was the one who had edited the rules, and he had handed out that edited version to the other headmasters. And his version of the rules conveniently excluded that information, and only that information. Needless to say, questions were being asked. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore was in rather a lot of trouble. Chapter 46, Riddle Me. This, when Harry slid into his seat at the Gryffindor table on the Wednesday before the end of term, he didn't really expect much to happen. The papers, of course, were still all aflutter about everything, but he was largely ignoring that now. Fleur was a voracious reader anyway, and would let him know if something came up. Dumbledore was notably absent from the head table again, which bothered him not a jot. "Do you know what you're doing for the summer?" Harry asked Neville once they had all tucked in. "I have no idea yet," Nev shrugged Harry. "I'll be in France with Fleur and her family, but that's all I really know right now." "We will have a good summer," smiled Fleur. "I cannot wait to take you on a tour of the area." Harry felt a rush of pleasure at that concept, and not just because of Fleur. He had never actually had a real summer vacation before, instead spending them all forcibly holed up at Privet Drive. To actually be able to go out and do things for the summer, that would be incredible. "I can't wait," he said softly. Fleur reached over and brushed his cheek, the soft look in her eyes telling him that she understood his reaction. "It will be wonderful, mon amour," she assured him. "And there are plenty of other things we can do as well." "I should get your contact information," noted Hermione. "My parents and I often travel to France in the summers, and it would be nice if we could stop in and see you." "Oui," smiled Fleur. "That would be magnifique. We can go shopping, too." The girls might have devolved right there into a discussion about shopping that only girls can appreciate, but they were interrupted by the arrival of the mail. Hedwig came to light on Harry's shoulder, and Fleur reached up to detach a scroll from her leg. Half the school stared openly at this. Hedwig was notoriously protective of her master's mail. "What?" she asked when she saw that Hermione was among those staring. "I'm surprised she let you do that," breathed Hermione. "She knows who Fleur is," smiled Harry, reaching up to scratch his familiar. "Of course she'll allow it." Fleur shook her head with a grin and skimmed the missive before handing it to him. He was surprised to see that it was a summons from Madame Bones, and an official one, at that. He was quite grateful that Dumbledore wasn't there to cause problems. "We'd better go right after breakfast," he sighed. "I don't know what she wants, but whatever it is, it's probably important." "Oui," nodded Fleur. They finished their breakfast quickly after that. Neither wanted to dally. Madame Bones struck them as the sort of woman who didn't mess about. If she was sending an official summons, then she had very good reason to do so, and keeping her waiting would not be wise. They made their way back to the carriage after saying goodbye to their friends, and from there they took the Floo to the ministry. Harry made a mental note to learn to apparate as soon as he could. It would be a lot more convenient. All talk in the ministry atrium stopped when they appeared, but other than the usual whispers that tended to follow him in public, people left them alone. The latter suited Harry perfectly, but the quiet scrutiny sent a shiver up his spine. He sincerely hoped that he was less famous in France than in Britain. Fleur had assured him that it was indeed the case, but he wouldn't truly believe it until he experienced it. Harry came very close to hexing the wand checker when he leered at Fleur, but clearing his throat at the man seemed to do the trick. It was as though he had simply locked in on Fleur and not noticed that her husband was standing right next to her. And given that her husband held the Order of Merlin and had recently bagged the Dark Lord Voldemort, nobody was going to challenge him. It was one of the few aspects of his fame that he was actually thankful for. Once they were through the gauntlet that was the atrium, they made their way quickly to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, which was a hive of quiet activity. Harry had once heard Vernon refer to this sort of place as a gopher pit. Numerous Aurors and other employees worked quietly away, occasionally popping up out of their holes to converse over the top of the cubicles. It was all of 10 seconds before they were spotted by Auror Tonks. "Watcher," she greeted, sporting hair that was vivid Gryffindor red today. "Hi," smiled Harry. He couldn't help it. The girl's obvious cheer was contagious. "Madam Bones sent for us." "Yup," Bob Tonks, gesturing for them to follow her. "Over here, she is." Fleur chuckled at the spunky Auror, and Harry was glad that she wasn't the jealous sort. Not that Harry would ever betray her. He meant the oath he swore at their wedding. No doubt, so did she. Tonks led them into Madam Bones' office, and the woman quickly sent her on her way. She didn't offer them a seat. However, Harry thought she looked rather distracted. "The message wasn't actually for a meeting with me," she said quickly. "The Department of Mysteries wants to talk to you. Follow me, please." Harry frowned, but followed just the same. He knew of the prophecy, of course, and that was the only thing he could think of that would have them contacting him. Except, "Maybe, Zay, you want to check your scar?" mused Fleur, to ensure that it was enled correctly. "Maybe," frowned Harry. She gave him a reassuring squeeze, and he refocused his attention back on Madam Bones, who was setting a brisk pace through the ministry corridors. They soon found themselves many floors deeper into the building, standing in the middle of a circular room, with 8 doors surrounding them. As soon as the door closed behind the trio, the room spun. It was an odd magical effect. Harry could tell that the floor was what was spinning, but with the lack of sensation, it actually seemed as though the walls were moving instead. Croaker ordered Madam Bones to no one and nothing in particular. There was a solid thunk from a door to their right, and she quickly led the way through, though she made sure to hold it open for them. Harry had the sense that getting lost in this place would be a bad idea. It was probably called the Department of Mysteries for a reason. At the end of this new hall was a single office, the occupant of which was an older, graying gentleman. Harry wasn't sure why he was showing his face. Rumor had it that nobody knew who the unspeakables actually were. Either way, he supposed it didn't matter. "Ah, Amelia," the man said, turning to Harry and Fleur, he added, "and these must be the Potters. You can call me Saul Croaker. I'm the current head, unspeakable." And Harry suddenly understood. They could call him Saul Croaker, but it was highly unlikely that was his real name or even his real appearance. "Interesting. You two have caused quite the ruckus over the past few months," he continued, oblivious to Harry's bout of understanding. "We've enjoyed watching the results. I must say, it's about time that bastard Malfoy paid for his crimes. For one," the darkness in the man's voice made Harry think that this man or someone he had known and loved had been a victim of the Death Eaters in the last war, and maybe Malfoy specifically. No surprise there. There weren't many who hadn't been touched in Harry's experience. In fact, the only ones who had come through relatively unscathed were those of a dark persuasion. And that was all thanks to Albus Dumbledore. He was the one who handicapped everyone, preventing them from fighting back with lethal force, even when lethal force was used against them. He got what he deserved, shrugged Harry. "Indeed, he did," agreed the man known as Croaker. "But alas, as amusing and frankly satisfying as your efforts have been, only one of them is the reason you're here today. Specifically, the capture and current disposition of one Tom Marvolo Riddle." Frowning slightly in thought, he added, "That isn't short for Thomas. Did you know? His mother actually named him Tom as his full name." "I don't even know who his mother was," shrugged Harry, deciding that he had no objection to playing whatever Croaker's game was, at least for the moment. Dumbledore hasn't exactly gone out of his way to let people know who their Dark Lord was, or even that he was apparently a half-blood. Strange considering how much support that might have stripped from him during the war. Strange indeed, agreed Croaker. But then, Dumbledore is also a blood supremacist, just in a different way than Riddle or his bunch. He would rather save the life of a pure-blood murderer than protect the life of a half-blood or Muggle-born student from the same. Draco Malfoy comes to mind. Then why does the Ave Z reputation as Z champion of Muggleborns? Wondered Fleur. Luck mostly on his part, smiled Croaker. He helped a few, and it got around. Besides, he doesn't actually want them dead. He just doesn't want them having significant influence on magical society. They're too progressive, and he'd rather our society stay mired in the 1800s, which is when he was born. Makes sense, nodded Harry. From what I've seen, nothing will change his mind, either. He's stuck in his ways. Exactly. Agreed Croaker, seeming pleased that Harry understood. Then he turned much more serious. But we've gotten off track. Are you aware that you are the subject of a prophecy, Mr. Potter? I am, he nodded, but I don't know what it says, and I'm not so sure I want to know. Smart lad, nodded Croaker. Seemingly changing the subject, he asked, are you willing to take the life of Tom Riddle? That seriousness of that question and the abrupt nature of it made him blink hard. I'd rather not if it's all the same to you, he frowned, but I would if it came down to it. Fleur stirred from her ongoing study of Croaker and gave Harry's hand a gentle squeeze. Riddle is a monster, she agreed. He needs to be put down. That does not mean we prefer to be Z ones to do E.T. Neither of us would hesitate, though. For his part, Croaker seemed inordinately pleased with their responses. Excellent, he replied. Much though I wish I could spare you the trouble, we have reason to believe that you do need to be the one to take this step, Mr. Potter. There is deep magic involved, and we don't want to find out if we're wrong. It could be disastrous. You already know of the Horcruxes. We have now confirmed that they have all been destroyed, including the one that resided in your scar, though why Dumbledore didn't. Croaker broke off suddenly and shook himself. No, let's not go there right now, he said. The important point is that they're gone. Riddle is now theoretically mortal again, but there are other things he has done to himself. We unspeakables believe that there is a very strong probability that someone else killing him will not actually work, and may release him again, possibly in an even worse form. Harry didn't need to guess at Croaker's aborted comments regarding Dumbledore. He, too, figured that Dumbledore knew of the Horcrux Tom, left behind in his scar, and did nothing about it. Unless they somehow got Veritaserum into the old goat, he would probably never learn the truth of that. And maybe not even then. As one of the few remaining alchemists, Dumbledore might be able to actually beat Veritaserum somehow. Focusing back on the present, however, he considered his options, and the simple truth was there weren't any. If he needed to be the one to put Tom down, then so be it. The bastard had killed his parents, so he wasn't going to balk, no matter how many nightmares it caused. Thankful that they had given him the time to think it through, he turned to look at Madame Bones. Are there any legal issues? He asked. I don't want to get hauled up for murder for offing a Dark Lord. Croaker smiled again. It was clear that he was impressed with the question. That's been taken care of, Mr. Potter, though I didn't understand why until now. The unspeakables, though me, negotiated a full pardon for both you and your wife for any actions taken in relation to Tom Marvolo Riddle. The order is classified, Omega, which means that even Fudge doesn't remember signing it, though it is magically certified, so he can't back out of it later. With that, she handed over a piece of paper, and Harry quickly read it through. It was exactly what she said it was. Fleur also read it, and nodded thoughtfully. Does it Ave to be known to Z public set? He was the one to do Z deed, she asked. Harry does not like Z attention. Harry nodded sharply. Good call, love, he agreed. That won't be a problem, Croaker assured them. We'll take all the credit, if you want. Please do, nodded Harry. So you're willing to do this? Harry looked Croaker straight in the eye. If that's what it takes to get rid of him for good. He said, yes. Excellent. Follow me. While Harry was surprised at the suddenness of it, he still stood handing his wife up while he was at it and followed Croaker out of the room, with Madame Bones bringing up the rear. He had the distinct sense that she was there just as a witness, or maybe to be his advocate if it came down to it. Either way, he felt better for her presence. Croaker led them through the maze that was the department, and Harry could barely keep track of the route. He doubted he would be able to find his way out of this place by memory. It was probably done on purpose. If you couldn't find things, then you couldn't steal or destroy them. Soon enough, they were in a different room, this one rather large. Steps or perhaps stone seats ringed it, going down to the center where a tall archway stood on a dais. A curtain of sorts hung in the center, blowing in a non-existent breeze. Just looking at it gave Harry a feeling of foreboding. On one side of the dais was a spindly table, upon which was a small glass orb, lit from within with a soft white glow. On the other side was a crib that had seen better days. Behind the crib stood another unspeakable, this one with his hood up and his face obscured. Croaker directed Harry to the crib. That's Riddle, he explained. All you need to do is toss him through the veil here, and that's it. And Zat will kill. Asked Fleur skeptically. It is called the Veil of Death for a reason, noted the other unspeakable ominously. The voice was so nondescript that Harry couldn't tell if the speaker was male or female. If you say so, he shrugged. I'm sure as hell not touching that thing, though. And with that, he drew his wand, even as the unspeakables both chuckled at him. A quick levitation charm had the unconscious creature lifted out of the crib, and he quickly tossed it in the direction of the veil. He was quite surprised when it vanished, and even more so when the little orb stopped glowing at almost the exact same time. And so it ends, intoned the unknown unspeakable. And then they nodded to Croaker and turned and left the room. For his part, Croaker palmed the darkened orb. Come, he said with a gesture. Let's go back to my office. Harry wasn't sure what he expected, but the whole situation was so sudden and so surreal that he didn't feel any different as they made the trek back. He thought he should feel guilty or something for taking a life, but he just felt nothing. Maybe a small amount of relief that Tom was gone, but he'd largely assumed that already, so it was minimal. He really wasn't sure what that said about him. As though sensing his confusion, Fleur gave his hand a squeeze, and he turned to find her smiling proudly back at him. He quickly realized that her opinion was all he cared about in the end. If his wife was okay with it, who was he to complain? They would discuss it later, he was sure. Once they were seated back in Croaker's office, the man put the orb down on the desk in front of him. Harry studied it carefully. It was clearly important, but he had no idea how or why. Apart from the bronze stand, the orb was seamless. He had no idea what it was. You don't know what this is? Asked Croaker, as though reading his mind. No, sir, he frowned. No guesses, prompted the man. I thought maybe some kind of monitor on Riddle to make sure he actually died, but something tells me it's more than that. Croaker smiled in that pleased way of his again. Indeed, he agreed, it could be said to be such a monitor after a fashion, but it is so very much more. This, Mr. Potter, is what we refer to simply as a prophecy sphere. Harry perked up at this. So the fact that the light went out means that whatever the prophecy was, it's done, he asked hopefully. Exactly. Croaker chuckled. Would you like to hear it now? It was given to Dumbledore by Sybil Trelawney, of all people. Her only known true prophecy. There's another one actually, he said absently as he considered his options. If the prophecy was fulfilled, then he supposed there was no harm in hearing it. He was curious, and had only been worried about screwing things up somehow, simply because he knew what it said. Another asked an astonished Croaker, "Do you know what it said?" Harry felt it something of an accomplishment that he'd surprised the man. He closed his eyes and recalled the event in question so he could get the wording correct, and repeated it word for word. "I thought it meant Sirius Black at the time, but it actually referred to Peter Pettigrew." "No wonder you were so hesitant to hear this prophecy," mused Fleur. "That would have been disastrous if you had acted on it without knowing the truth." "Indeed," agreed Croaker thoughtfully. "Prophecy is perilous, they say, and they are usually right. You were likely very wise not to listen to this one until now, when it's already completed." "I would like to hear it," admitted Harry after a moment. "Seems to me that if Dumbledore was the one who heard it originally, it will probably explain a lot about his interest in my life." Croaker chuckled and nodded as he tapped his wand on the sphere. The image of Sybil Trelawney rose from the orb and began to speak in the same harsh, guttural tones that he'd heard once before. When the recording ended, Harry was flummoxed. "That twaddle was what had Dumbledore all up in my life?" he asked in astonishment. "Is that glow magical? Because that thing could have been fulfilled in 1981. All the conditions are met." Croaker blinked at that. "That's a very good point, but yes, the glow is magical. It won't go out until the prophecy is completed." Harry shook his head, feeling a surprisingly deep sense of loathing toward his former headmaster. He suddenly realized that his subconscious had still hoped that there was something that might excuse the old criminal's behavior, though now that was clearly no longer the case. In fact, it made it worse. "You realize that Dumbledore committed treason, don't you?" he asked quietly. Croaker's eyebrows went up, but it was Madame Bones who asked the question. "What do you mean?" she frowned. "I think I see where you are going, mon amour," frowned Fleur. "And you are right, not just against the British Iser." Turning toward Bones and Croaker again, she added, "What would the correct course of action be if you heard this prophecy, and then the presumed subject was orphaned?" Croaker eyes widened. "Oh my," he breathed. "You take that child and raise him right, teaching him all you can to make him a force to be reckoned with, which in and of itself could be considered not living in the same sense as what Dumbledore did to you, but far less harmful." "I don't disagree with that," frowned Bones. "But how does that equate to treason? That's a serious charge." "Simple," said Harry, closing his eyes against the anger welling up inside. "The prophecy says that the one with the power approaches. Not the first one. Not one of many. Just the one. The clear implication is that there won't be another. Dumbledore kept me completely untrained and made me weaker at every turn." His voice falling to a whisper, he concluded he was setting me up to die, to fail. And that would have meant that Voldemort won, possibly forever. There was a stark silence in the room in the wake of this declaration. Each of them were clearly considering the implications. Fleur's arms came around him as he struggled against the incredibly powerful sense of betrayal that arose within. This was so much worse than just stealing his money. "Saul," asked Bones faintly, "is his interpretation correct?" Croaker was staring blankly at the wall, clearly disturbed by Harry's statements, but suddenly shook himself and sighed a heavy sigh when the question finally registered. "In a word, Amelia," he said, "yes, prophecies are known to be very specific that way. And I didn't see it until he just pointed it out." "Merlin," she breathed. Harry just shook his head, though. "It doesn't matter anymore," he said quietly. "Tom is gone, and the prophecy is fulfilled. And we can't change the past. I am going to string that son of a bitch up by his sodding beard," growled Amelia lowly. "It's not worth it," sighed Harry softly, leaning back into Fleur again. He's already going down hard for stealing from my estate. Even if he misses out on a stay at the Azkaban resort, nobody will ever respect him again, let alone trust him. That's honestly a much worse punishment for an egotistical bastard like him. Chapter 47, The End of an Era. Fleur was at a loss as to how to help her husband. The revelation of the prophecy and what it said about Albus Dumbledore shook him far worse than she would have expected. It was one thing to know that he'd been betrayed, he told her, but quite another to know that the man was trying to get him killed, and what that would have meant. And there truly was no other interpretation of events as far as they could see. Along with Bones and Croaker, they had hashed it out a bit more and could come to no other conclusion. The final analysis they had come up with was that, at best, Dumbledore knew of the Horcrux in Harry's scar right from the off, and set him up to die in order to get rid of it. The prophecy itself would prevent any direct action, thus he had to die by Voldemort's own hand. He also utterly failed to consider what it would mean for the world if his plan succeeded, namely that Voldemort would win and probably take over the world. Harry was disturbed by it, but in a way it was probably a good thing. He was facing it and would put it in the proper place in due time, and he would be better for it. In the end, though, all Fleur could do was offer the comfort of her presence. Her father, of course, was incensed when they told him, but he agreed with Harry's assessment. There was nothing to be done. They would put him away via the theft trial and go from there. It was now Friday, and the last classes of the term were finally finished. They would be here for another few days before the carriage left for France, and Fleur fully expected Harry to be on it, returning home with her. It would be interesting to see his reception at the school. For now, however, they were once more sitting down for dinner in Hogwarts' Great Hall. Dumbledore was once more riding his throne, and she was not at all surprised to feel his angry gaze upon them. His upcoming trial was giving him fits. Everyone presumed him guilty, which he was, and the students were no exception. This was the final nail in the coffin of Albus Dumbledore's vaunted reputation, and so she ignored him. Her young husband, on the other hand, was flipping through a book she had obtained for him. It was a tourist's guide to France, both Muggle and magical. He was trying to learn about his new home country, and also trying to decide what he wanted to do this summer. She expected that they would have a lot of fun. Harry had never had a true summer vacation before, and would likely want to do everything. Even having Gabrielle along would not be a deterrent. He adored the girl, and had never himself experienced many of the things a child her age would want to do. It would be quite rewarding for him to accompany her. While Fleur always looked forward to getting away from school for the summer, this particular one was likely to be the best she had ever experienced. Earth to Potter, chirped a male voice. Female Potter, that is, chirped another. Fleur blinked and looked up into the amused faces of the Weasley twins. Out of all the Weasleys, these were the two that she liked best. Oh, Bill was handsome and clearly a good man, but the twins were a lot of fun, and yet far more serious under the surface than most likely suspected. "Something I can do for you?" she wondered. "We were just asking Harrikins here," spouted twin number 1. "If there was any possibility of coming to visit over the summer," continued twin number 2. "Your lovely husband gave us his Triwizard winnings. See, we want to start a joke shop. And we thought that maybe between your husband and your oh-so-beautiful self-dash, along with the infamous Padfoot, we might come up with some good ideas for new joke products." Fleur turned to Harry and raised an eyebrow. "It's fine with me," he shrugged preemptively. "Not sure how much help I'll be, though." Before Fleur could answer, however, the doors to the great hall abruptly swung open. Every eye in the place turned to the doorway, where a gaggle of cloaked strangers were gathered. They looked to be adults, and mostly somewhat older ones, and they didn't hesitate to make their way up the center aisle toward the head table. Dumbledore rose from his throne. "Brock," he queried, clearly surprised to see whoever this was. Albus, a man replied. What are you doing here? Wondered Dumbledore. School is still considered to be in session until the students leave the grounds. We're aware, Dumbledore, came a female voice from the end of the row of people. Fleur felt she had heard it before, but couldn't place it. That they had their hoods up made it difficult for her to identify anyone, assuming she would even know who they were with her limited view of British politics. The question was answered. However, when across from Hermione, Neville stiffened. That's my Gran, he whispered. Fleur blinked. The board has been in discussion for some time now, Albus, explained Brock, and the conclusion we arrived at this afternoon should come as no surprise to you. Your appointment as headmaster of Hogwarts is hereby terminated. We expect that you will be out of the castle by first light tomorrow morning. You could have heard a pin drop in the great hall, so silent was the student body. Even the foreign students were listening attentively. Albus Dumbledore was known worldwide, and it wasn't every day you saw a wizard of his stature lose everything. Fleur could only think it justice, and she had no doubt that Harry felt the same. You know you cannot do that, Brock, frowned Dumbledore. Actually, came a much more familiar voice from the closest end of the group. It was the voice of Amelia Bones. Few knew that she had been elected to replace Lucius Malfoy on the Board of Governors. Your tenure is being rescinded for cause. Albus, your recent actions relating to the tournament added to your continuing disrespectful treatment of the Potters, and in addition to the legal charges pending against you, have brought Hogwarts into disrepute. That's cause enough right there. Fleur blinked at the reference, and wasn't surprised when Dumbledore turned toward them, his anger clearly spiking, but the board was prepared for that. Don't look at them, Albus, snapped Brock. The Potters did not report you, though they would have been well within their rights. More than a dozen others did. However, further inquiries showed that the vast majority of the staff and student body considers your treatment of them abominable. It's over, Albus, came the voice that she now knew to belong to Augusta Longbottom. Pack your bags. You're done. Perhaps we should discuss this in my office, frowned Dumbledore. It's no longer your office, snapped Longbottom impatiently, and there's nothing to discuss. Pack your bags and get out. Brock put a hand on Augusta's shoulder. Bluntly put perhaps, but accurate, he said easily, Augusta is right. There is nothing to discuss. We won't be changing our minds. Please go gather your things and vacate the premises. Albus, you are no longer the headmaster, effective immediately. Fleur could do little but stare in morbid fascination as the scene unfolded, and knew that Harry was doing much the same next to her. This was like a dream come true. Her only regret was that they could not have done this months ago. A Hogwarts without Dumbledore in charge would likely be a far better place, in her opinion. For a long moment, Dumbledore just stared at the group before him. And Fleur thought he might have a cardiac event, either that or start cursing everyone in sight. But finally he deflated, suddenly looking as old as he actually was. He shuffled around the table and out of the hall with nary another word. The silence was deafening. Once he was out of the hall, Brock spoke up again. Minerva, would you be so kind as to take over as headmistress for what little remains of the term? Discussions are still ongoing, so I cannot promise a permanent appointment at this time. I would be honored, Governor Brock, nodded McGonagall. Also, I would like to speak with the board when you have the time. I have certain concerns that I believe were not sufficiently addressed by Albus. Any time, Minerva, replied Bones. Brock, meanwhile, turned toward his impromptu audience. Students of Hogwarts, he announced, please take this as a clear statement that we have heard your complaints and are now taking action to see the issues corrected. Your former headmaster held too much power for us to act before. That has now changed, and we want to see things corrected as much as you do. To our guests, we apologize for the situations you have been forced to witness. Rest assured, We will return Hogwarts to its former glory, and perhaps in the future you might visit again and see that for yourselves." A cheer went up throughout the hall, though Harry and Fleur remained silent. As happy as they were to see the man removed, it was also the end of an era. Change would be coming to the school, and only time would tell if it would be good or bad. And so it transpired that Albus Dumbledore left Hogwarts in disgrace, not with a bang, but with a whimper. The man had clearly been shocked that the Board of Governors had dared to oust him, and hadn't known what to say. The article that followed in the next day's Daily Prophet praised the board for its decisive action, and further pilloried Dumbledore. Nobody shed a tear for the latter. At lunch the next day, Harry received a note that McGonagall wanted to see him in her new office. He wasn't at all surprised by this. He had a feeling he knew what was coming. Unlike Dumbledore, however, McGonagall at least had the decency to include his wife in the invitation. And unlike Dumbledore, it actually was an invitation, not a summons. Harry smirked at the thought that things were already getting better with the absence of the old goat. He and Fleur made the familiar trek, but this time Fawkes remained in the Great Hall rather than accompany them. He was busy playing with the twins, and with Dumbledore no longer in residence, Harry had no need of help to keep his cool, nor did he need to defend himself from legilimency, as he highly doubted McGonagall would ever be so crass. They arrived at the gargoyle only to have it jump aside for them, and he wondered if it would do that for everyone now. He had the sense that McGonagall would be far more approachable than Dumbledore ever was, assuming they kept her. And he hoped they did. While she had her foibles, they all seemed honest ones rather than the clear disregard for the students that Albus Dumbledore so often displayed. They knocked on her door when they reached the top of the staircase, and were quickly invited in. Harry, however, stopped in shock when he saw the office. The change was immediately noticeable. Gone was the clicking, whirring, and clacking that had normally greeted them here. None of Dumbledore's spindly little toys adorned the shelves any longer. Instead, there were books on those shelves, as one might more rightly expect in a school, though a couple of the higher ones were given over to what were obviously various awards and trophies of indeterminate origin. The change, though not unwelcome, was entirely unexpected and caught him completely off guard. "Thank you for coming," came McGonagall's stern voice, breaking through his examination of the new atmosphere. "Please come in and have a seat." Shaking himself, he turned to see her smiling knowingly at him. In front of her desk was a comfortable chair that he was absolutely certain had not been there when they entered the office. It also was clearly big enough for two, which amused him for some reason. He and Fleur happily took a seat. Both of them liked the woman, and neither were concerned about what would happen in this meeting, though if Harry was right about his suspicions, she wouldn't get what she wanted. And sure enough, "I asked you here, Mr. Potter, in the hope of convincing you to return to Hogwarts next year, now that Albus is gone," she said bluntly. Harry appreciated that she didn't beat around the bush. The woman stood and moved to look out the window, and Harry simply remained quiet. He could tell that she wasn't done yet. Finally, she sighed. "I owe you an apology," she said, turning to look him in the eye. "In many ways, I failed you almost as badly as Albus did. My only defense is that it was not intentional. I have every intention of ensuring that does not happen again." Harry couldn't help but be touched, and he teared up slightly as his emotions once more escaped his control. A squeeze of the hand from Fleur helped him wrestle it back, though he was getting better at that. He couldn't wait until he was emotionally stable again. The instability was annoying. Apology accepted, he finally said, "Your mistakes were honest, Professor, and you at least tried." She smiled at him. "Thank you," she replied. Harry gave her the time as she let out a faint sigh and settled in at her desk. It was obvious that she already knew that they wouldn't return, apology or no, but she was going to try anyway. He could respect that. I know that returning next year would be an inconvenience, to say the least. She finally said, I'm very prepared to be flexible there. It would be easy enough to arrange for private quarters for you both. Also, we do have need of several professors and assistants, so we could quite possibly find a place for you here career-wise. Mrs. Potter, if you're interested. Harry turned to Fleur, who was shaking her head in vague amusement. It wasn't the impolite sort, just the sort that said that the offer was all too expected. And it was. They had both discussed this the previous evening when Dumbledore was ousted. The approach would be coming. They knew. It was only who, when, and what they would offer that were questions. I appreciate the offer, Madam Headmistress. She smiled. But I must decline. I already have an offer from Gringotts, contingent only on my final grades, and will be accepting E.T. McGonagall's mouth quirked in amusement. I'm not surprised, she replied with a smile. You are obviously capable, and given the publicity in the tournament, you will likely be quite highly sought after, at least for a while. Fleur snorted cutely. They can dream, she grinned. Harry chuckled at her response, and that drew McGonagall's gaze back to him. Strangely enough, he really didn't want to disappoint the woman. He had the sense that she really would be a good headmistress, but that ship had already sailed. He wasn't staying, and not because of Sebastian's assertion that his original transfer would be for good. I have to decline as well, he told her quietly. McGonagall nodded, clearly having expected this. May I ask after your reasons, Mr. Potter? She queried politely. I expected your response, but for my own sake, I would like to know so that I can pass it on to the Board of Governors. I'm sure you're aware that they will pressure me to get you back once they realize that the transfer was not a bluff. Harry exchanged a long look with his wife. While he really didn't care what the board thought, he was all too aware that things had been as bad as they were because the majority of that board was bought, probably with his own money, but he didn't want to leave McGonagall in the lurch. She was probably going to take a lot of flack for his refusal, and that wasn't fair. Finally, he sighed and turned back to the newly minted headmistress, however temporary that appointment turned out to be. There's a lot of reasons, he admitted softly. The fact that my wife and her family are in France is only the obvious one. The rest. Now, it was Harry's turn to get up and move off to stare out the window. He had honestly tried to avoid thinking about this. There were too many bad memories tied up in this school. Only his budding skills in occlumency allowed him to face it with any kind of aplomb. It wasn't just the staff of the school who failed me. He finally sighed, rubbing his eyes in sudden exhaustion. What do you mean? Asked McGonagall. He frowned in her voice coming through clearly. Fleur had some rather strong opinions on this topic, and he was thankful that she was keeping them to herself at the moment. While those opinions largely matched his own, he really needed to be the one to say it, not only so that the woman knew it was coming directly from him, but also because he felt an almost primal need to finally express it. How many times did the students here turn on me, Professor? He asked rhetorically, turning to look at her again. He could tell she was shocked by the question. The first time I could forgive, he informed her. Maybe even the second. But this year, they should have known better. Harry shook his head and moved to sit back down next to his wife. And the rest of the country isn't much better. Just look at how I was treated by the papers. The only reasons to stay would be the few friends I have here. And I'm sorry, but that's just not enough reason to put up with everything else that comes with it. McGonagall's expression was pained as she sat back in her chair, her eyes closing in near grief over what she had just heard. What was missing, though, was any element of surprise. How could she be surprised? Nobody with two eyes could have missed what had happened over the years. I understand, she finally said, once more looking at him. In your shoes, I suspect I would do the same. For what it may be worth, I think your parents would be proud of you, and I think they would have supported your decision. All they would have wanted is for you to be happy." Harry couldn't respond to that with anything more than a nod. He was too busy clamping down every last bit of control over his suddenly chaotic emotional state. He cast about his memory, but could not remember hearing anyone not even serious ever telling him in such a direct way that his parents would have approved of him. He knew she was sincere, and she had known them. It was a statement he cherished. Fleur's arms came around him, and he sank into her embrace, trying to use it to anchor himself. He had enough control now that he wouldn't burst into tears, but it was difficult. Strong emotions could still sneak up on him, and he needed more experience in reining them in. Luckily, it was only the positive ones. Harry sighed heavily as he looked around the hall from the comfort of his wife's embrace. His emotions were still volatile, and so she was staying close, having learned over the last few months that he truly craved her touch. Where most people's touch made his skin crawl, hers was soothing. He didn't know if he would ever understand why there was such a difference. He certainly wasn't complaining, though. Soon they would board the flying carriage that would take them to Beauxbatons Academy in France. Harry was somewhat ambivalent about that. He had met few of the students since Fleur had no friends there and had no idea how he would be received. He genuinely hoped they would simply ignore him. In the meantime, he took in the state of the castle he had once thought of as home. The castle was, oddly enough, in a much better place than it had been during that event. They had lost a horrible professor of potions, and shortly thereafter the worst bully in the school. Those two changes alone had a massive impact on everyone. The school was a much more pleasant place. With the exodus of Albus Dumbledore, there were also other changes afoot. McGonagall had given an impromptu speech to the students and warned explicitly that she would not be anywhere near as tolerant of bullying as was Dumbledore. That also meant that slurs like mudblood would be heavily punished. Harry's immediate reaction was to wonder why Dumbledore hadn't done that in the first place, but then he remembered the words of the unspeakable. Dumbledore was simply a different kind of blood bigot. It was disturbing to see all the indications that that was true. He hadn't yet shared that with Hermione, and she would probably be horrified when he did. Soon, though, it would no longer be his problem. Leaving his wife aside, the changes in Harry's life were less obvious, but no less significant in many ways. Hermione Granger had proven herself to be a true friend in a way he had never expected. She had helped him greatly, especially where his abrupt marriage was concerned. He owed her big time. He was very glad that she was transferring to Beauxbatons with him, though McGonagall was just as disappointed by that fact. Hermione had also been one of her favorites. Ronald Weasley, on the other hand, would never be welcome in Harry or Hermione's company ever again. He had shown his true colors, and neither were about to forgive him. Harry had no idea how he turned out the way he had given the rest of his family, but then Percy was an idiot, too. Maybe it was just luck of the draw. "I'm surprised that Ron hasn't been sniping at us," he suddenly mused. He hadn't seen Hyde, nor Hair of the Redhead, since Easter. "I didn't tell you," asked Hermione in obvious surprise. "Professor McGonagall threatened him with immediate expulsion if he ever bothered us again. She was furious with him for trying to hit me." "As she should have been," growled Fleur darkly. "Huh," nodded Harry. That would explain it. Harry finally spotted his former friend all the way at the other end of the Gryffindor table, and couldn't help but feel an unwelcome pang of sympathy. The boy was all alone, and it was clear he was being shunned by his housemates. While it was well-deserved, Harry knew from experience just how much that sort of thing hurt. He could only hope that Ron would find new friends next year since he and Hermione wouldn't be here. Harry no longer felt like he had personally lost much with the loss of that friendship, but he knew that Ron had lost a lot. The only question was whether he would ever truly realize what exactly it was that he'd lost. Still, it was his own fault. Harry was just disappointed that he hadn't turned out to be a better friend. Up at the head table, Madame Maxime finally stood, followed quickly by the students of Beauxbatons. "It is time, mon amour," sighed Fleur. Both of them rose respectfully and took a few moments to say goodbye to their few friends at Hogwarts, while Hermione did the same next to them. And then they began the journey out of the great hall toward the carriage. Harry was curious what it would be like to fly in that thing, but he was also apprehensive. This was where it became an unavoidable truth that his life had truly and irrevocably changed. "Relax, Harry," came Fleur's smiling voice. "You will have time to adjust before you must attend Z school. You'd think I would be ready for this," he mused. "Not like it's the first time I've stepped into a new world. Is it?" "It's always different," noted Hermione. "Just because you handled one change doesn't make you automatically ready for the next one. I'm nervous too, Harry, but we'll get through it. I'm glad you're coming, Hermione," he smiled. "I'm not sure what I'd do without you, especially since Fleur won't be there next year. Hopefully your parents will let you stay with us and go as a day student," agreed Fleur. "I haven't heard back on that yet, but I expect they'll be fine with it," smiled Hermione. "They liked your parents, so it shouldn't be an issue." The conversation tapered off as they reached the carriage and filed inside. Fleur, Harry, and Hermione made their way to the suite that the Potters were staying in, which just so happened to have a balcony. They fully intended to sit outside and enjoy the weather for the flight home. Here on the ground, it was turned such that they had a perfect view of Hogwarts Castle. "I will miss this place if I'm being honest," Hermione sighed, once they'd settled in. "There's so much history here." "I'll miss the castle itself," Harry said, "but everything else, not so much. The students, most of the professors, I think we're well shot of them." Hermione seemed to struggle with that for a moment, even as the carriage started bumping along the ground, gaining speed in preparation to take flight. Then she deflated, though. "I wish I could disagree," she sighed, "but it was honestly worse than my Muggle school, and that's saying something. If not for you, I wouldn't have stayed." "You will have a better time at Beauxbatons," promised Fleur, "especially once Zae knows that you are an Order of Merlin older. That sort of thing confers respect." Harry could only chuckle at Hermione's disgruntled expression. She wanted to be known for her abilities, not her awards, and now she understood why Harry had so many problems with that sort of attention. It was almost funny. Harry leaned into Fleur as the carriage finally lifted off the ground. They watched in silence as the castle grew smaller in the distance, until it finally vanished from sight. Now, there was nothing but blue sky all around. "Well, there's no turning back now," smiled Harry. "Wazir, ever once you agreed to marry me," grinned Fleur. The three laughed as the carriage took them off into a new future. Only time would tell what it held for them, but for the first time in his life, Harry genuinely thought it would be a bright one. Chapter 48, Epilogue. Sebastian and Ariane Delacour were absolutely thrilled to welcome Harry into their home and treated him as beloved family right from the beginning. It was hard to watch as he struggled through counseling sessions to undo the damage wrought by the Dursleys, but it was also immensely rewarding to see him overcome it. They never once regretted their decision to get involved, even discounting his impact on their daughter. As the years went by and Harry continued opening up, he and Sebastian became very close. Harry learned a great deal from the older man. More importantly, they had what was undeniably a healthy father/son relationship, and neither of them was complaining. Ariane was likewise close, and loved gently mothering him whenever he was around. And unlike Molly Weasley, she knew when to back off, and she never questioned his character, either. that Molly had done, so would always boggle her mind, even after mere months of knowing the young man. When they eventually passed on many decades later, their loss was felt keenly by the entire family, and that very much included Harry Potter. It would turn out that Sebastian had indeed read Rita Skeeter's article the morning of the third task. A single fluke call was all it took to set the ball rolling. He had been waiting for this ever since he heard that Rita was allowed to interview Harry alone. She just could not help herself. And he felt strongly that this would be where she finally screwed up, and he was right. Contrary to Remus Lupin's belief, the majority owner of the Daily Prophet was actually also the editor, a man named Barnabas Cuff, though Fudge did own most of the rest. He was served with a lawsuit the very next morning, and it was quite the doozy. He nearly had a heart attack just reading the documents he was served with. The Potter family, via Sebastian Delacour's legal team, was suing for damages in more than sufficient amount that they would end up owning the Prophet outright. Even worse, it looked to Cuff like they had a very good chance of winning. Rita had well and truly hacked off the wrong people this time. Firstly, they were suing over Rita's all-too-obvious libel of Harry Potter over the course of the year. This Cuff expected, and certainly could have weathered. But then they added that they were suing over every single Harry Potter quote that had ever been published over the years, and there were hundreds of them, none of which had actually been uttered by Harry Potter in any way, shape, or form. And finally, Sebastian Delacour, as agent of House Potter, had declared Hermione Granger a protectee of the house. They were also suing on her behalf over Rita's libel of her earlier during the tournament. And given how easily disproven those accusations were on top of everything else, the lawyers now had Cuff over the proverbial barrel. Cuff contacted Sebastian Delacour the very same day with every intention of settling out of court. He wasn't sure what that would involve, but he was sure it would be expensive, albeit less so than letting them win the court case. In the end, the Potter family walked away with 20% ownership in the Daily Prophet, a guarantee that full-page apologies would be printed for the Potters and Granger in a week's time, and possession of a nice, juicy tidbit about a now forcibly retired Rita Skeeter. The woman was arrested the following day on suspicion of being an unregistered animagus. While that would have merely meant a fine, normally she was not a pureblood, and they were able to question her under veritasrum about her activities as a beetle. And those activities, many of which translated to espionage, saw her receive a 5-year prison sentence at the Azkaban resort. While she survived it with her sanity intact barely, she was not so foolish as to remain in the country. She fled to Germany, never to be heard from in Britain again. So far as the Potters were concerned, all was well. The trial of Albus Dumbledore, which took place 3 weeks after school let out, was a worldwide sensation. That the defeater of Grindelwald had sunk to such depths was horrifying to any right-minded witch or wizard, regardless of culture or even so-called blood status. Had he kept his fingers out of the Potter pie, some might still have excused him, but the very public proof of the theft saw his reputation forever shattered. Of course, had he realized just how far his support had waned, he would likely have never shown up for the trial. Dumbledore was nothing if not deluded as to his own fallibility. He assumed that his reputation and his many fanatical supporters would carry him through, and he was so very, very wrong. The charge of grand theft was paramount, of course, but in the interest of expediency, they also piled on various charges surrounding the tournament. One of those charges based on the newly discovered original rules was that of attempted murder of the last remaining heir of the Potter family. Oh, he tried to talk his way out of it, but without the blinders that so many of his supporters had once worn, his excuses fell on deaf ears. He was convicted on all counts. The Wisengamot also then held a second trial, closed to the public, and he found himself charged with treason, just as Harry had inadvertently suggested. And he was convicted, too, for exactly the reason Harry specified. That he received another long sentence was largely redundant given the first trial, but Amelia Bones was annoyed and wanted everything on the record, so to speak. It was this trial that had the Wisengamot up in arms. After swearing everyone to magically enforced oaths of secrecy, they proceeded to dose the old man, who was not, after all, a pure blood, with veritaserum. Then they questioned him on his activities surrounding Voldemort and the prophecy. Sometime during the war, old Albus had become enamored of the idea of going down in history as the first wizard to ever defeat 2 certified Dark Lords. And then the prophecy was dropped in his lap, and not wanting to give up that dream, he immediately set about working around it. He felt that, prophecy or no, he was easily qualified to deal with Tom, and that once the prophecy was out of play, he would be able to do so. Seeing to the failure of Fate's Chosen was little more than a necessary inconvenience. He wasn't worried about how long it took, however, because he also believed that he swindled the Flammels out of their precious philosopher's stone back in Harry's first year-all part of the plan. He never considered that, at 600 plus, the Flammels might actually be smarter than him simply by dint of massive amounts of life experience. They played along and gave him a fake, warning that the first time it was used would put him out of commission for at least a year. And that last part, at least, was even true. Rather than make the elixir of life, the stone they gave him would produce something similar to the draught of living death. Unfortunately, he never tried it, much to their disappointment, but one enterprising Wisengamot member, who managed to purloin it a few months after the trial, ended up falling victim to it. But that was a different story entirely. As for Harry Potter, he was disgusted by the old man's motives. It would have been one thing if he had genuinely thought he was protecting the world or something of that nature, but he wasn't. Albus Dumbledore was only out for Albus Dumbledore, and that was that. The old man spent the rest of his life in Azkaban and claimed to his dying day, only a few years later, that Harry Potter had to die to destroy Voldemort. Thankfully, his reputation had been so thoroughly ruined that nobody believed a single word that came out of the man's mouth, especially with the Department of Mysteries having openly refuted that assertion during the trial. And thanks to the secrecy oaths, the existence of the prophecy was never made public. While it took some time, there was a lot to do the departure of Albus Dumbledore as headmaster saw Hogwarts swiftly regain the prominence it had once held in magical education. The aging headmaster had been holding it back significantly, and in more ways than anyone knew. As Harry and Hermione also quickly discovered, the international standards were far higher than those that Hogwarts taught to. Dumbledore also had his fingers in the wizarding examination authority pie. His interference ensured that the standards were kept low enough that pure-blood children could continue to pass the tests in spite of the declining magical power of the old inbred families. The education on offer at Hogwarts was tuned to match wherever he could get away with it. Upon discovering this, McGonagall urged the board to correct it. And correct it they did. The professors were suddenly required to teach to international standards which McGonagall, Flitwick, and Sprout already had been, but nobody else was, and more importantly, the students had to prove themselves capable of casting the relevant spells. The number of pure-blood students that failed their newts spiked dramatically in the wake of the change. In previous years, they had been given a pass based on theoretical knowledge, even if they couldn't cast the spells, but that was no longer true. When the new educational standards were combined with McGonagall's hardline stance on bullying, the result was astonishing. Hogwarts was once more a school that Britain could truly be proud of. It only took 4 years to fully achieve, 2, hardly the impossibility that Dumbledore would have claimed had he known. And Cuthbert Binns never taught another class, ever again. On the wider front, magical Britain was shocked senseless by the abrupt departure of their most celebrated citizen. That Harry Potter would abandon them was a bitter pill to swallow. It wasn't until a series of articles came out decrying his choices when he failed to return after graduation, however, that the general public abruptly learned just how badly they had failed their supposed savior. On the advice of his father-in-law, Harry Potter wrote a personal letter to the people of magical Britain and ensured that it was published verbatim in the Daily Prophet. The letter was blunt and brutally honest, and while Harry laid most of the blame squarely on the shoulders of Albus Dumbledore, there was still more than enough to go around. If he was such an important icon to magical Britain, why did nobody else notice what Dumbledore was up to? Why did nobody else check on him when he was a child? Why were so many allowed to profit from his name when he never saw a canute of that profit? They were questions that nobody could answer and perhaps that nobody wanted to answer. In the end, Harry got what he wanted. Magical Britain moved on without him, too ashamed to do anything but finally leave him alone. It helped that the rising standards at Hogwarts were starting to cause a ruckus around the same time due to so many pure-blood children failing their newts. They couldn't keep the lid on that story for very long at all. Several pure-blood families tried to pass laws to reverse the educational trend, but they failed spectacularly. It was a little-known fact in magical Britain that the hardliner purebloods were actually in the minority and only had any power due to the efforts of people like Lucius Malfoy. Had it been otherwise, Voldemort would never have had to start a war in the first place. And the fall of Lucius Malfoy had an unexpected side effect. It was well known that those hardliner purebloods were all, for whatever reason, of a dark persuasion. With Malfoy's crimes having come fully to light, everyone now suspected the other dark families of having similar proclivities, and nobody wanted them back in power. Even those on the dark gray side wanted nothing to do with those families whose heads were former Death Eaters. After several failures at reversing the trends in education and society at large, there was a brief uprising by those same dark families. Unfortunately for them, Amelia Bones was not Albus Dumbledore. The perpetrators, who attempted to torture and murder their opposition, were killed nearly to a one and in very short order. This nearly wiped out the dark families, and those few that remained would never again regain the prominence they once held. Between the educational reforms and the rather anticlimactic fall of those families, magical Britain slowly turned around and began to make its way into the modern era. But as far as anyone knew, Harry Potter never returned. Speaking of Lucius Malfoy, he lasted just shy of 12 years in Azkaban before his mind snapped. He spent most of those 12 years alternating between unquenchable rage at Harry Potter for ruining his life and gibbering terror whenever the Dementors were near. He held out hope of his master returning for the first month or so, but then his dark mark vanished. That only made him hate Harry Potter all the more. After his mind snapped, he lasted for another 25 years before finally passing on. He was buried in an unmarked grave and forgotten. Nobody would truly miss him, not even his wife or son. Draco, on the other hand, somehow managed to make it through his 10-year sentence. Those years in Azkaban were probably the best things that ever happened to the blonde Ponce. From a certain point of view, like his father, he suffered gibbering terror whenever the Dementors were near. Unlike his father, however, he was young enough that he was actually capable of changing, at least to some small degree, and the consequences of his actions were not to his liking. He did, of course, blame Harry Potter for quite a while. The constant exposure to the Dementors, however, changed his tune by the end of the second year. They continually showed him that not only was Harry Potter actually better than him, but also that Harry Potter didn't care one way or another about Draco Malfoy. To Harry Potter, Draco Malfoy was a nonentity, and so was Lucius. Harry Potter would not bother going to the effort of throwing a nonentity into Azkaban, which meant that it couldn't be Harry Potter's fault, that what he was being shown was the invention of his addled mind as a result of the Dementor exposure was irrelevant. He couldn't help but see it as reality once he was presented with it, and some subconscious part of him decided that it was true. This did not, of course, make him like Harry Potter, nor did it magically make him a good or nice person. It did, however, redirect his murderous rage toward his father, who had been dumb enough to get caught for the stupidest of reasons. And much more importantly, it taught him that his actions actually had consequences. Draco Malfoy would never again even attempt to cast dark magic. It simply wasn't worth the risk for a short-lived rush of power. He was a wreck when he left Azkaban 10 years later. On top of that, without having completed his basic magical education, he had no wand rights. And most maddening, he discovered that his mother had sold Malfoy Manor and absconded with what little was left of the family fortune, leaving her son totally destitute. It was all legal thanks to the rather lopsided marriage contract that the Blacks had insisted on. Malfoy Manor was now a Muggle children's home. He was appalled. He managed to earn a few galleons working at the Leaky Cauldron, but after having to clean up after a drunken Ron Weasley won too many times, he quit after less than a month. He had just enough saved for an international portkey and caught the next one that he could afford, landing himself in Australia. He eventually managed to obtain wand rights there and worked as a clerk in an apothecary for many years thereafter. Had anyone from Hogwarts ever run into him, his expression and attitude would have made them wonder if he was being possessed by Severus Snape. Ron Weasley remained a pariah for the rest of his Hogwarts career, even after Harry and Hermione left the school. Rather than realize his mistakes, he blamed Harry Potter for every ill that befell him. The fact was, however, that nobody wanted to listen to him bitch about 3 of their favorite people, and they made it clear early on that he could either shape up or ship out, so to speak. That Headmistress McGonagall agreed with her students was a shock to Ron's system. He blamed Harry Potter for turning her against him. His grades in his 4th year were abysmal, and unlike Dumbledore, McGonagall would not ignore that fact and simply pass him on. Truth be told, he should have been held back in all 3 prior years as well, but Dumbledore passed him, probably because he was a useful boat anchor around the neck of one Harry Potter. This year, he was held back as he should have been. Ron's response? He blamed Harry Potter for taking Hermione Granger away from him. If she were there, he reasoned, he would have passed his classes. When he moaned to his fellow students about it, they explained in great detail that he was responsible for his own grades, and that Harry Potter had nothing to do with it, and nor did Hermione Granger. Then they told him to shut up and study, because they didn't want to hear it. That 4th-year students were telling him off when he was supposed to be a 5th year incensed him. His response? He blamed Harry Potter for turning the other students against him. Then he picked up another Quidditch magazine to read. Ron did do one truly impressive thing from a certain point of view that his brothers never managed. He set the record for the number of years spent at Hogwarts prior to receiving his OWLs. He repeated the 4th year twice more, and then repeated the 5th year twice. Ronald still hadn't even sat his OWLs when Harry and Hermione took their newts. Ronald Weasley refused to understand that he had to do the work and that Harry Potter and Hermione Granger were not responsible for doing it for him. By the time he finally achieved his OWLs, even Molly was disgusted with him, and she was well known for ignoring the faults of her children. Molly and Arthur had sacrificed quite a lot of their plans to force Ron through to his OWLs, and they flatly refused to pay for his newts, telling him that he could get a job and pay his own way if he wanted to continue at Hogwarts. Ron's response was predictable. He didn't care about school anyway. For the next 6 months, he lazed around the burrow, eating his parents' food, reading about Quidditch, and occasionally flying his broom in the paddock. Finally having had enough, his mother told him he had to go get a job. Ron complained that if not for Harry Potter turning the Quidditch team against him, he would be flying for the Chudley Cannons. Molly, tired of his idiocy, kicked him out of the house. The twins took pity on him for all of a month. They, too, quickly got sick and tired of hearing him bitch about Harry Potter, who by now had left Britain almost 7 years prior. On top of that, he refused to actually work, expecting that they would hand him a fat bag of galleons simply because he existed. Then he overheard that Harry and Fleur had helped fund their joke shop and exploded, complaining that Harry Potter and his whore never gave him any money. Needless to say, he was out of a job and out of a place to stay. The twins were close friends of the Potters, and their dedication to family only went so far. It was nearly a year later, after living on the streets, reduced to eating scraps out of trash cans, blaming Harry Potter the whole time, that he finally sucked it up and got a low-paying job at the Ministry in Magical Maintenance. He would keep that job until his death at the age of 102, and while he more or less reconciled with his family, he never did stop blaming Harry Potter. Ron Weasley, needless to say, never married and never amounted to much of anything. Bill, on the other hand, kept in touch with the Potters and was considered a good family friend. 2 years after the tournament, he was injured when a fellow curse breaker did something stupid, which said curse breaker did not survive. He woke to find himself stuck in a bed at the very same hospital in Paris where he had once removed a Horcrux from Harry Potter's forehead, and quickly learned that he wasn't getting out anytime soon. When he was released 4 months later, whole and hale, thankfully, he took Naomi Parks on vacation to her country of origin, and they got married in Las Vegas, neatly avoiding what might have happened had Molly learned of it ahead of time. They would go on to have several children together, and both were very happy. Naomi would have been less so if not for the fact that Bill was now relegated to managing curse breakers, rather than breaking curses himself, due to his injuries. Fleur teased the pair incessantly whenever she saw them, and they remained good family friends for a long, long time. Harry was always happy to play with their children. Fred and George Weasley likewise kept in frequent touch with the Potters and with Padfoot, and occasionally Moony, with the sole exception of a certain month where they tried to do right by their brother. The Potters didn't blame them for that incident, though. They pitied them instead. Their joke shop was a major success in both Britain and France, and it wasn't long before they expanded to the Americas. They insisted on the Potters retaining partial ownership in accordance with their investment, and all of them made out like bandits. The business would remain in their respective families long after they had all passed on. While Fred and George never officially married, neither did Angelina or Katie, and the children of those two women had hair that was a rather specific shade of red. All of said children, and there were quite a few, called Fred and George Dad interchangeably. While Alicia occasionally visited, she was much smarter and married a Quidditch player that hadn't attended Hogwarts. Harry and Fleur rarely saw the rest of the Weasley family after the tournament. Molly never really recovered from the embarrassment of having inappropriately tried to claim Harry as family. It was too bad, really, since he never actually held it against her. He was far more annoyed with Dumbledore for prompting it. They did see them on rare occasion, but only coincidentally. It didn't help that Ron lived with them on and off over the years, and neither Fleur nor Harry wanted anything to do with him. Ginny, on the other hand, was friendly but distant. While she had long since realized that it wasn't Fleur's fault, it didn't change the fact that her heart was well and truly broken by Harry's marriage to another witch. While she moved on, she would never truly get over it. Harry often wondered over the years if Dumbledore might have had a hand in her obsession, but unfortunately he passed away before anyone thought to ask. She had a successful career as a chaser with the Holyhead Harpies, and eventually married a young Frenchman she met while on the circuit. She was fortunate to find him. He was an understanding sort, and knew very well how she felt about her longtime hero. He himself respected Harry greatly, and understood the full nature of the story. They saw the Potters once every 6 months or so, but that was about it. Anything more was just too painful for Ginny. Luckily, the rest of her life was happy, and she positively doted on her only daughter. Said daughter graduated from Beauxbatons rather than Hogwarts. Though that was mostly down to her father, Ginny was ambivalent as long as she was happy and well-educated. As it happened, Harriet Devereux was one of Harry Potter's favorite students. Vernon and Petunia Dursley ended up in prison before the third task ever took place. The Prime Minister somehow learned of the matter and was absolutely appalled. And then the Queen learned of it and ordered him to deal with it with all due haste. Harry Potter was, after all, considered a hero of the First Voldemort War, and the Queen was well aware of that fact. The trial was fair and impartial, but no less damning for it. They were each sentenced to 50 years in prison. Their son was given over to a home for troubled children in the hope that he could be reformed. It took almost 6 years of heavy counseling, the last few of which were actually voluntary, surprisingly enough, to fully break the boy from his parents' conditioning. Once he finally understood the magnitude of their crimes, he was horrified, on top of which, by some strange coincidence, his counselor just so happened to know about the magical world and filled him in on who his cousin truly was. Dudley never sent an apology even by post, but not because he wasn't sorry. He simply felt that it would do more harm than good, and that Harry was better off forgetting all about them. He went on to find a decent job and a lovely wife, and treated his children far better than Vernon and Petunia had ever managed, and not by spoiling them, either. Unlike his son, however, Vernon was irredeemable, and even had it been otherwise, he never would have seen freedom anyway. The man's belligerence was so ingrained that he simply couldn't keep his mouth shut. He was beaten to death 2 years into his sentence after mouthing off to the wrong person one too many times. Nobody ever learned who was responsible. Petunia was smarter and managed to achieve parole after only 15 years. She attempted to contact Dudley in the hope of reconnecting, but was soundly rebuffed. Her own son wanted nothing more to do with her. She ended up alone and bitter for the rest of her life, and much like Ronald Weasley, she never stopped blaming Harry Potter. Sirius Black remained in France near the Potters and Delacours, to absolutely nobody's surprise. His friends in school, even James and Lily, would have been shocked at just how dedicated he was to his godson, though it took some effort, but he somehow managed to find that perfect balance, spending just enough time with Harry that he was happy, but not enough that he felt crowded. And watching Harry and Fleur's relationship grow and blossom was really quite the joy to the old dog. Oddly enough, he did eventually find love for himself, and James would have been impressed that he actually managed to land a villa. After Sirius married her, he bought a thermometer and a set of snowshoes, and laid them on Lily's grave in Godric's Hollow. She had once told him that hell would freeze over before Avila ever gave him the time of day. Strangely, it wasn't through the Delacours or Potters that Sirius met Sylvie. He actually found her drowning her sorrows in a backwater bar in magical Paris. For years, she had been constantly and horribly bullied about her looks. Her peers at the colony she lived in apparently considered her ugly. Sirius thought she was beautiful. While she was much younger than him, at only 22, he was a big kid anyway, so it didn't really matter. He somehow talked her into going dancing that night, and it continued from there. 4 months later, he invited her to a family gathering, and she said yes. Her shock at learning who she was meeting was priceless. She was from one of the more isolated Vila colonies and had no idea who Sirius actually was. She did, however, know who the Potters were. They were big news or big gossip, rather in Vila circles, not that they cared, that they wanted to meet her, had her nearly fainting in shock. And luckily for her, the Delacours and Potters and most other Vila for that matter had a very different definition of beauty. Upon learning of her plight, Ariane told her point blank that her peers were simply bullies who were intimidated because she was so much better looking than them. She moved out of the colony and in with Sirius 2 weeks later. They were married 2 months after that, on their first anniversary. Young Sylvie used some of the massive black fortune to purchase Malfoy Manor and gifted it to Sirius, along with the already-in-progress contract to convert it to Muggle use as an orphanage. It was one of the best anniversary gifts he could have imagined. They had 2 little girls, whom the entire family doted upon. Sirius didn't give even a single damn that the Black family name died with him. Hermione Granger graduated Beauxbatons with top marks, which was impressive given the lackluster nature of the education on offer at Hogwarts. From there on out, she was sought after by potential employers all over Europe. That she held the Order of Merlin didn't hurt any. Unfortunately for most of those employers, Hermione was content to remain close to home, which she now considered France to be. Her parents had moved there just before she graduated, and she was happy to remain. She had no friends from her Muggle days anyway, but the Potters and Delacours, they were practically family. Most of her work was centered around blending magic with Muggle technology. Unlike magical Britain, France was rather progressive and had no laws restricting such things. It was seen as furthering the statute of secrecy, in fact. The more they could use their magic without being noticed by Muggles, the better off they were. She was responsible for quite a large number of inventions over her lifetime, but the most notable was the magical version of a cellular telephone. That one invention ensured that her children's children would never want for anything. She dated Neville from afar for another year after leaving Hogwarts, but they were just too different in the end and parted as friends. She also dated 3 boys at Beauxbatons, but none of them for long. They just didn't hold a candle to the man that she couldn't help but compare everyone else to. When the 3rd of those boys tried to force her into more than she wanted to give, he learned that her Order of Merlin was not merely for show, and then found out the next day that Harry Potter's prowess in combat magic was, if anything, understated. That started a decade-long dearth for the witch. She did go on a few dates, but nothing serious. Nobody caught her fancy. It did not escape the attention of her friends and family that she also spent the vast majority of her time with Harry, and Fleur, the latter of whom was just plain thrilled to have such a good female friend. Nobody was foolish enough to comment when she gave birth to a daughter out of wedlock 11 years after she graduated, especially given that said daughter had green eyes and jet black hair. So did her 2nd and 3rd. For some reason, Ariane Delacour thought it was hilarious. Hermione remained a fixture in the Potter family home right up through her death at the ripe old age of 210. As far as Gabrielle Delacour was concerned, Harry Potter was the best brother-in-law that anyone could ever have. She loved him to bits, and he her. And he always had time for her, whether it was playing a childish game in her younger years, or listening to her romantic frustrations in her teens, or commiserating about her child's latest antics in her adult years. In the end, her only vague regret was that she hadn't been older and in more danger when the incident occurred. She loved her husband very much, but Harry was special, and she couldn't deny that she envied her sister. It was a feeling that she would only ever admit to her husband. However, Harry and Fleur never learned of it. She went on to have a successful career as a fashion model, and then, to Fleur's surprise, decided to stay at home with her 2 children when she finally had them. She ended up living near Harry and Fleur, and Harry remained one of her favorite people for the rest of his life. Her sister wasn't so bad either. As for Harry and Fleur, the first few years after the tournament were more difficult than either expected. It wasn't that life was hard or that they had problems. Neither of those things were true. It was that they had become quite used to being together most of the time, and now they were forcibly separated for most of the day. It was only the fact that they could be together at night that made it bearable. The two had fallen far more deeply in love than anyone could ever have expected. Merlin's blessing, indeed. Like Hermione, Harry graduated with top marks. The Horcrux in his head had really done a number on him in his early years. He found it far easier to concentrate and far easier to study now, and thus was born the friendly academic rivalry between himself and the best friend he had next to his wife. In the end, he graduated in the number 2 spot to Hermione's number 1. Even in France, every employer wanted a piece of the boy who lived, especially given his marks, but Harry was ambivalent. He really didn't need to work, especially given that much of the Malfoy and Lestrange estates was now his on top of the Potter estate, but he also didn't want to be bored. He decided to wait until something interesting came up, and in the meantime spent his days inventing random joke products to send to the twins. A year after he graduated, he was approached by the British Department of Mysteries and ended up working as an unspeakable under Croaker off and on for more than a century. Only Fleur and Hermione ever knew what he did for them, and that caveat was a condition of his employment. He would not take a job that he could not tell his best friends about. They also occasionally helped out very much on the department's payroll. Nobody in Britain outside the department ever knew they were there, which was just the way they liked it. Fleur tried her hand at curse breaking with Gringotts, but while she was good at it, it wasn't her passion. She found her passion rather accidentally when Fred and George's first child was old enough to start learning. Fleur absolutely loved to teach. It wasn't long before she took a job at Beauxbatons, much to the surprise of everyone who knew her. Harry supported her fully, and even took a job there teaching defense against the dark arts. That it made for a nice cover for their work with the department in Britain was just a bonus. He liked teaching almost as much as his wife did. The only cloud on the horizon was Hermione's lack of luck in the romance department. The incident with the last boy she seriously dated had dented her trust significantly, and she found it hard to get close to anyone. On top of that, in spite of what she told Ariane years prior, she did not see Harry as a brother at all and knew nobody else who compared to him even a little. They spent so much time with her that it was hard not to notice her increasing depression, though she tried very hard to keep it from them. It was Fleur who finally broke through and forced her to confess that she was madly, deeply, and irrevocably in love with Harry. She then swore up one side and down the other that she would never even dream of coming between them. Fleur shut her up via the simple expedient of snogging her senseless. She slept in their bed every night thereafter. As it happened, Harry and Fleur had discussed their feelings for Hermione off and on starting shortly after they left Hogwarts. It started out that they were both extremely grateful for her friendship Harry because he had never had friends before her and Ron, and of the two only she had been true, and Fleur because she had a hard time making friends, period. Even today, 6 months after they left Hogwarts, Fleur admitted in a random conversation that Hermione was the only woman that she had ever found sexually attractive. Harry reluctantly admitted a year later that he found her attractive too, and had often wondered what she looked like naked. A few years after that, after one too many drinks on their annual anniversary trip, they found themselves missing her presence dearly and finally admitted to each other that they were both in love with Hermione Granger, almost as much as they were in love with each other, and that they had no clue what to do about it. Needless to say, when Fleur snogged her senseless and then dragged her to Harry, who promptly did the same, the poor woman was more than a little shocked and confused. That didn't last long. Her first daughter was born 9 months later, only 2 days after Fleur's son. Ariane had laughed and laughed and laughed. Hermione would never live down her little white lie before the 3rd task. Explaining the situation to the elder Grangers was a challenge, but Harry managed. He was simply honest with them about everything. When they realized just how difficult things had been for their daughter to that point, they finally decided that it was up to them to make it work and not really any of their business. Besides, whether provided by Hermione or Fleur, they absolutely doted on their grandkids, as did Sebastian and Ariane. And it didn't really change much anyway. They already did almost everything together anyway outside of the bedroom, so they simply continued on with their lives. They deliberately avoided the spotlight as a matter of course. Hermione was actually the most well-known of the three in the end due to her inventions. Harry and Fleur were both more than happy to remain in the background and be her support. Fleur had a son and 2 daughters, and Hermione had 3 daughters. Harry loved all of them immensely, and all of them would go on to be responsible members of the French magical community. It would be centuries, in fact, before the Potter family ever even considered returning to Britain, despite their roots. Harry Potter passed on surrounded by his extensive family at the age of 209, barely a week after Hermione's passing. Fleur Potter followed only 1 day later. All 3 considered their lives well spent. Contrary to all rational expectations, Severus Snape actually survived his sentence at Azkaban, all 137 years of it, with his mental faculties more or less intact. Say what you would about him, he was gifted in the magical mental arts. And part of how he survived was by focusing all of his mental capacity on one single thing: plotting the demise of Harry James Potter and his Vila wife. Upon his release, he immediately started making inquiries. It wasn't long before he learned that Potter had fled to France, or at least that was how Snape's biased mind interpreted his actions. Unlike Draco Malfoy, Snape still had some funds, and so quickly caught a portkey and started searching. He eventually learned of a location that they visited regularly on the weekends, and found himself a nice spot atop an adjacent building. His plan was simple. He would wait until they appeared, and then use the most destructive curses available to him to erase the Potter family from existence. It would only be justice for what they did to him, as far as he was concerned. Nobody ever said that Severus Snape knew the actual meaning of the term justice. And the Potters appeared right on schedule, and there was that know-it-all Granger right there with them. And there were multiple Potter spawn. It was perfect. They might be old now, but revenge was a dish best served cold. His mouth stretched into an evil smile, his blood pumping in anticipation as he stood and prepared to call upon his magic for a devastating blow. He couldn't help his excitement. Finally, he would have his revenge on that scum James Potter and his ill-begotten son. He raised his wand, gathered his magic, and then his heart seized up the excitement just too much for a man of 168 years and who spent most of that time in Azkaban prison. Severus Snape would be found on that rooftop 2 weeks later and declared dead by natural causes. Nobody ever figured out why he was there. The Potters themselves never even learned of it. Contrary to popular belief, fate really does look after her champions. And that was the end of champions. Not every champion survives. Not every scar fades. But the journey, every step of it, was unforgettable. This wasn't just a retelling of the Triwizard Tournament. It was a reinvention. And through it, Champions by Thor's Shadow asked us to look deeper, not at who wins, but who grows, who endures, who dares to change. What did you think of the ending? Which character arc stood out the most to you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and join the conversation. If this story gripped you, moved you, or made you rethink the tournament altogether, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with your fellow magical readers. You can also join our Grimoire Guardians or the Wizard Army to help us continue discovering and sharing incredible stories like this. Did you know? Thor's Shadow originally planned Champions as a standalone short, but fan demand turned it into a full multi-part epic. The lore, tasks, and twists were heavily inspired by Greek myth and war-era strategy fiction. As we close this chapter, let's carry its message with us. Being a champion isn't about standing on a podium. It's about standing back up again and again when the world tells you not to. Thanks for listening. Stay courageous, stay compassionate, and as always, stay magical.